Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I had been looking forward to my camping trip in the Black Hills for weeks. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape, just me, nature, and the quiet. I'd picked a spot that was off the beaten path, far enough from the usual campgrounds so I could really be alone. The drive out was beautiful, the kind of scenery that makes you feel small in a good way. When I arrived at the spot, it was perfect. There was a clearing surrounded by tall pines, and you could hear the wind rustling through the branches. I set up my tent and got a fire going as the sun started to set. The colors in the sky were incredible, deep oranges fading into purples. Everything felt just right. As night fell, I sat by the fire, enjoying the warmth and the sounds of the forest. It was quiet, just the occasional crackle from the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. I had brought a book but found myself just staring into the flames, lost in thought. It was the kind of night where you feel completely at ease. I decided to turn in around 10. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped up the door. The sleeping bag was warm, and I could still hear the wind in the trees. I fell asleep quickly, feeling safe in the solitude I had sought. A few hours later, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me, but then I heard a twig snapping, not far from my tent. My heart started to race. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something. But then I heard another snap, this time closer. I held my breath, straining to listen. There was a soft rustling, the sound of something moving through the underbrush. It wasn't an animal, the steps were too heavy, too deliberate. Someone was out there. I lay still, hoping whoever it was would just move on. But the sounds didn't go away. They were circling the tent, slow and quiet, like they were trying not to be noticed. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on, shining it around inside the tent. The light made me feel a little better, but the fear was still there, gnawing at me. Suddenly, the sound stopped. It was dead silent, and that scared me even more. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't know what to do. Should I stay in the tent or try to make a run for it? I decided to wait, hoping whoever was out there had gone. Then, I heard a voice, low and gruff. "She's in there," it said, followed by a snicker from someone else. My stomach dropped. There was more than one of them. I could barely breathe, trying to keep as quiet as possible, but I knew they were close. Too close. I grabbed my phone, thinking I could call for help, but there was no signal out here. I was completely on my own. The voices started talking again, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. It sounded like they were arguing, and then, suddenly, something slammed against the side of the tent. I jumped, dropping the flashlight. The tent shook as they hit it again, laughing this time. They were toying with me, enjoying the fear they knew I was feeling. I couldn't stay in there. I had to get out before they decided to take it further. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, praying they wouldn't hear. The cool night air hit me as I crawled out, staying low to the ground. I could see their shadows near the fire pit, two of them, big and looming in the dark. I started to move, slowly at first, then faster as I put more distance between myself and the tent. I had no idea where I was going, just that I needed to get away. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they'd hear it. Then I heard footsteps behind me, fast and getting closer. They had noticed I was gone. Panic took over, and I started to run, my feet slipping on the uneven ground. I could hear them crashing through the woods after me, shouting and laughing. I didn't look back. I just kept running, branches scratching at my face and arms. The only thing I could think about was getting away, finding somewhere to hide. I saw a cluster of boulders up ahead and veered toward them, hoping they would provide some cover. I ducked down behind the largest one, trying to catch my breath and stay as quiet as possible. My chest was heaving, and I could taste the fear in my mouth, metallic and sharp. The footsteps were still behind me, but they were slower now, more deliberate. They were searching for me, and I knew they wouldn't give up easily. I pressed myself against the cold rock, willing myself to be invisible. The voices were closer now, taunting, trying to flush me out. "Come on out," one of them called. "We just want to talk." There was a dark amusement in his voice, and I could hear the others chuckling. I stayed still, barely breathing. I could see their flashlights sweeping through the trees, the beams cutting through the darkness. The light passed over the boulder I was hiding behind, and I held my breath, praying they wouldn't see me. For a moment, it seemed like they might move on, but then I heard one of them say, "Check over there by the rocks." My heart sank. I had to move, now. I waited until the flashlight beam moved away, then I started crawling, keeping low to the ground. I managed to slip away, moving deeper into the forest. The trees were thick here, and the underbrush was dense, but I kept going. The sound of their footsteps faded a little, and I started to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe I could lose them. But then, I heard a crash of branches and realized one of them had broken off from the group, coming straight toward me. I picked up my pace, trying to stay quiet, but the ground was littered with dry leaves and twigs. Every step seemed to make too much noise. I spotted a small ravine up ahead, a dip in the land that might give me some cover. I scrambled toward it, sliding down the slope. At the bottom, there was a shallow creek, the water barely a trickle. I crouched down in the mud, hoping the sound of the water would mask my presence. The footsteps were above me now, moving along the edge of the ravine. I could hear them talking, their voices tense. "Where the hell is she?" one of them muttered, and the other responded with a frustrated growl. I stayed still, crouched in the cold mud, listening as they argued. They were close, too close, but then one of them said, "Forget it, she's gone. Let's get out of here." Relief washed over me, but I didn't move. I waited, listening as their footsteps retreated, and finally, everything went quiet. I stayed there in the mud for what felt like hours, too scared to move. My whole body was shaking, both from the cold and the fear. When I was sure they were gone, I slowly climbed out of the ravine, my legs unsteady beneath me. I didn't go back to the campsite. I couldn't. Instead, I started walking in what I hoped was the direction of the nearest road. The night was still and dark, the stars above me offering little comfort. I kept moving, too afraid to stop, even though every muscle in my body was aching. It was just before dawn when I finally stumbled onto a road. There were no cars, but I kept walking, sticking to the edge where I could dive into the trees if I heard anything. Eventually, a car did come by, and I waved it down. The driver was an older man, and he looked concerned when he saw me. I must have been a sight, covered in mud and scratches, but he didn't ask too many questions. He just let me in and drove me to the nearest town. I never went back to that campsite. I left my tent and everything else behind. I didn't even file a report with the police, too shaken to try and explain what happened. I just wanted to forget it, but I can't. The memory of those men, their voices, and the fear that gripped me that night will stay with me forever. I had been looking forward to camping in the redwoods for a while. I had been there before, but never alone. I thought it would be a good chance to clear my head and get away from everything for a few days. I packed my gear, drove up from the city, and found a spot deep in the woods. It was peaceful, quiet, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional bird. I set up my tent and started a fire. The woods were thick, but there was enough space around my site to feel open. I liked that I couldn't see anyone else, no other campers around. It felt like I had the whole forest to myself. I sat by the fire as it got dark, just enjoying the solitude. I could see the stars through the treetops, and it felt like the world had disappeared. After a while, I decided to turn in. The tent was warm, and the sleeping bag was comfortable. I fell asleep pretty quickly, but at some point in the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure what had woken me, but I had that feeling you get when you're not alone. I listened for a while, but everything was quiet. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe an animal and went back to sleep. The next morning, I noticed something strange. My backpack, which I had left outside by the fire, had been moved. It was only a few feet from where I had left it, but it was open. I was sure I had zipped it up the night before. Nothing was missing, but it didn't make sense. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I hadn't closed it properly or that an animal had been nosing around. I packed up and went for a hike, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. The day was beautiful, the kind of day that makes you forget about everything else. I walked for hours, losing track of time. When I got back to the campsite, it was late afternoon. I started to get dinner ready, and that's when I noticed something else. My tent had been unzipped. I knew I had zipped it up before I left. I was careful about that kind of thing, especially when camping alone. I looked inside, but nothing seemed out of place. My sleeping bag was still there, my stuff was untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I started to feel like I was being watched, but when I looked around, there was no one. The trees were so thick you couldn't see far, but I couldn't hear anything unusual. Just the wind and the creaking of branches. I tried to brush it off again, telling myself it was just my imagination. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, soft footsteps, like someone was walking around my tent. Every time I sat up to listen, the sound stopped. I unzipped the tent and looked outside, shining my flashlight around, but there was nothing there. I felt ridiculous, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. The next day, I decided to cut my trip short. The idea of spending another night out there didn't sit right with me. I started packing up, but I kept hearing things in the woods, just out of sight. Twigs snapping, rustling leaves, but whenever I looked, there was nothing there. I tried to move faster, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, just beyond the trees. As I was taking down the tent, I heard it again, footsteps, closer this time. I froze, listening. They were slow, deliberate, like whoever it was didn't want to be heard. My heart was racing. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the sound, but again, nothing. Just trees and shadows. I finished packing as quickly as I could and started the hike back to my car. The whole way, I felt like I was being followed. Every few minutes, I would stop and listen, but the footsteps would stop too. It was like a game, and I was the prey. I started to walk faster, almost running, my heart pounding in my chest. I finally made it back to the car and threw my stuff in the trunk. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there for a minute, trying to calm down. That's when I saw him. Standing just at the edge of the trees, maybe 50 feet away. He was tall, thin, and wearing dark clothes that blended into the shadows. His face was pale, almost ghostly, but his eyes were what scared me the most. They were locked on me, unblinking. For a moment, I couldn't move. We just stared at each other. Then, he took a step forward, and that broke the spell. I started the car, threw it into reverse, and got the hell out of there. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror, and he was still standing there, watching me. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road. Even now, I can't explain what happened. I don't know who he was or why he was out there. All I know is that I was being watched, hunted, and that if I had stayed another night, I might not have made it out. I decided to go camping alone in the deep woods of Kentucky. I'd been out to the area a few times before, but never this far in. I wanted to get away from everything, just me, nature, and some peace and quiet. The idea of being completely alone in the wilderness sounded like exactly what I needed. So, I packed up my gear, drove out, and hiked until I found a spot that felt right. It was isolated, no signs of anyone around for miles, exactly what I wanted. The first day was peaceful. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and spent the afternoon exploring the area. The woods were dense, thick with trees and underbrush, but there was a small clearing where I'd pitched my tent. As the sun started to set, I made a fire and cooked a simple dinner. The silence out there was almost eerie, but I liked it. No cars, no people, just the sounds of the forest. As night fell, I sat by the fire, enjoying the warmth and the quiet. It got dark fast, the kind of dark where you can't see your hand in front of your face if you move away from the fire. I wasn't scared, though. I'd been camping enough times to know that the woods at night can play tricks on you if you let them. So, I told myself there was nothing to worry about and went to bed. The next morning, I woke up early, packed a small bag with some snacks and water, and decided to go for a hike. I had a map, but I wasn't planning on going too far, just far enough to see more of the area. The trail I followed was barely visible, more like a path made by animals than people, but it was easy enough to follow. The woods were thick, but every so often, I'd come across a small clearing or a stream. After a couple of hours, I noticed something strange. A small cabin tucked away in the trees. It wasn't on the map, and I hadn't expected to find any signs of people out here. It looked old, the kind of place you'd imagine someone living in 100 years ago. Smoke was coming from the chimney, though, so I knew someone was there. Part of me wanted to turn back, but another part was curious. Maybe they knew the area better than I did, could tell me more about the trails, or even share some local stories. As I got closer, I saw movement. A man stepped out onto the porch, followed by a woman and a young boy. They saw me, and I waved, trying to be friendly. The man waved back, but something about it felt off. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and the woman just stood there, staring at me. The boy was the only one who looked somewhat normal, curious like kids are when they see a stranger. They invited me to come closer, said they didn't get visitors often. I hesitated but figured I was being silly. They seemed nice enough, and I was in the middle of nowhere, so it's not like they were expecting me. I walked up to the porch, and the man introduced himself as John. He was polite enough, asked what I was doing out there, and I told him about my camping trip. He seemed interested, asked where I was camped, and I told him, not thinking much of it at the time. The woman, who I later learned was his wife, didn't say much. She just stood there, watching me, like she was studying me. The boy, though, he was chatty, asking about my gear, if I had any food, stuff like that. They offered me some water and a place to rest for a bit. I figured why not, it's not like I was in a hurry. So, I sat down on the porch, and we talked for a while. The more we talked, though, the more uneasy I started to feel. John kept asking questions about how long I'd be out there, if anyone knew where I was, things that made me feel a bit paranoid. I tried to steer the conversation away from myself, asking them about their life out there. They said they'd been living off the grid for years, didn't much care for society and liked the isolation. That part made sense, but there was something in the way they spoke, like there was more they weren't telling me. Eventually, I decided it was time to leave. I thanked them for the water and the conversation and said I needed to get back to my campsite. That's when John's smile faded. He said it was getting late, that I should stay the night at their cabin instead of going back to my tent. The woman nodded in agreement, but I could see something in her eyes, something that made my skin crawl. I politely declined, saying I'd be fine, but they insisted, more forcefully this time. That's when I realized I needed to get out of there. The way they were looking at me, like they were planning something, it sent chills down my spine. I stood up, thanked them again, and started walking back toward the trail. As I did, I heard John say something to the boy, but I didn't catch it. I just kept walking, trying to act normal, like nothing was wrong. The further I got from the cabin, the more I picked up my pace. I didn't want to run, not yet, but I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see them following me. And then I did. The boy was standing at the edge of the trees, just watching me, but when he saw me look back, he turned and ran back toward the cabin. I didn't waste any more time. I started running, as fast as I could, trying to remember the way back to my campsite. The woods seemed thicker now, more confusing, and I kept stumbling over roots and rocks. I could hear footsteps behind me, more than one set, and I knew they were coming after me. I pushed myself harder, desperate to get back to my tent, to get to my car and get the hell out of there. When I finally reached the campsite, I didn't stop. I grabbed my keys from my bag and bolted for the car. As I got in, I looked back and saw them emerging from the trees, John and the boy, with the woman behind them. They weren't running, but they were coming closer, fast. I started the car, slammed it into gear, and tore out of there, the wheels spinning on the dirt. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, miles away from the forest. Even then, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see them following me. I don't know what they wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. The way they looked at me, like they were sizing me up, like I was prey, it still haunts me. I haven't been back to the woods since. I don't know who they were or what they were planning, but I'm just glad I got out of there before I found out. When camping in the wilderness of Idaho, looking for some peace and quiet. It was supposed to be a weekend trip, just me and the great outdoors. I picked a spot far from any trails, a place where I wouldn't run into anyone else. I wanted to be alone, to disconnect for a bit. The drive out was long. The last stretch was on an old dirt road that seemed like it hadn't seen traffic in years. I parked the car, grabbed my gear, and hiked until I found a good place to set up camp. I set up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by trees. It was perfect. I had a small stream nearby, enough firewood to last the weekend, and no signs of anyone else for miles. I pitched the tent, unpacked my supplies, and got a fire going before it got dark. The first night was uneventful, just the usual sounds of the forest. It was calming, in a way. I went to bed early, figuring I'd wake up with the sun. The next morning, I noticed something strange. My gear wasn't where I left it. My food bag, which I had hung from a tree to keep animals away, was on the ground. It was still tied shut, but it had been moved. I thought maybe it was the wind, or maybe I hadn't secured it as well as I thought. But then I noticed my water bottles were missing. I always kept them in the same spot, right next to the tent. They were gone, not a trace of them anywhere. I searched the area, but it was like they had just disappeared. I tried not to overthink it. Maybe I had left them somewhere else, though I couldn't remember doing that. I had enough water in my backup supply, so I shrugged it off and went about my day. I spent the morning hiking around, exploring the area. It was beautiful, untouched, just what I had hoped for. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest was too quiet, like it was holding its breath. When I got back to camp, the uneasy feeling got worse. Someone had been there. My things were moved again, my tent slightly unzipped, and the firewood I had collected was scattered around. I knew for sure I hadn't left it like that. Someone was messing with me. I looked around, calling out, but no one answered. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I was miles from anyone, or so I thought. I decided to pack up and leave, but when I reached the spot where I had left my car, it wasn't there. At first, I thought I had taken a wrong turn, that maybe I was disoriented, but I knew the area well enough. My car was gone. I walked around, searching for any signs, but the dirt road where I had parked was empty. There were no tire tracks, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I was stuck. Panic started to set in. I had no way to contact anyone, no cell service, and now no vehicle. I decided to head back to camp, figuring I could retrace my steps and find a way out. But when I got back, the situation got even worse. My tent was slashed open, my remaining supplies thrown everywhere. Whoever was doing this wasn't just messing with me, they were trying to scare me. And it was working. As the sun started to set, I realized I was trapped. The path I had used to hike in was blocked by a fallen tree, a fresh one, too. Someone had cut it down, making sure I couldn't leave. I tried to find another way out, but the underbrush was too thick, and it was getting dark fast. I was stuck in that clearing, with no way to defend myself and no idea who was out there. I spent that night by the fire, clutching the only thing I had for protection, a small camping knife. Every sound made me jump. I kept the fire going, thinking it would keep whoever was out there away. But as the hours passed, I started to feel like the fire was just making it easier for them to find me. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and they were getting closer. I couldn't see anything beyond the light of the fire, but I could feel someone watching me. I called out, asking who was there, but no one answered. The footsteps stopped, and then there was silence. I didn't sleep at all that night, too scared to close my eyes. At first light, I decided to make a run for it. I grabbed what little I had left and started moving, not caring which direction as long as it was away from the camp. I figured if I kept going, I'd eventually find a road or a trail, something that would lead me back to civilization. But as I moved through the forest, I started to realize how hopeless it was. Every direction I went, something blocked my way. It was like the forest itself was trying to keep me in. By midday, I was exhausted and no closer to finding a way out. That's when I saw them. 3 figures, standing just inside the tree line, watching me. They didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, staring. I yelled at them, asked what they wanted, but they didn't respond. I took a step forward, and they stepped back, disappearing into the shadows. Whoever they were, they didn't want me to leave. I kept moving, but no matter where I went, I felt like I was being followed. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, hear whispers just out of earshot. They were playing with me, like a cat with a mouse. By the time the sun started to set again, I was back at my camp, no closer to escape than I had been that morning. I was completely and utterly trapped. I didn't bother with a fire that night. It didn't feel like it would help. I sat in the dark, knife in hand, waiting for them to make their move. I could feel them out there, circling, getting closer. The forest was alive with sounds, but none of them were comforting. They were taunting me, letting me know that they were in control. Hours passed, and I was losing hope. I was exhausted, scared and ready to give up. Then, just before dawn, I heard something different, a voice, clear and close. It was a man's voice, low and calm, saying my name. I didn't know how he knew it, but he did. He kept saying it over and over, getting closer each time. I wanted to run, but I knew there was nowhere to go. Then, I saw him. A figure emerged from the trees, tall and thin, with a face that looked wrong, like it didn't quite fit. He just stood there, watching me, a twisted smile on his lips. He didn't say anything else, just stared at me, like he was waiting for me to make the first move. I don't know what came over me, but I ran. I bolted into the woods, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away from that smile. I ran until I couldn't breathe, until my legs gave out, and I collapsed on the ground. When I looked up, he was gone, but I knew he wasn't far. I spent the next day stumbling through the forest, too tired to think, too scared to stop. Every time I thought I had lost them, I'd hear a branch snap or a whisper on the wind. They were always just behind me, always watching. By some miracle, I stumbled onto a dirt road. I didn't recognize it, but it didn't matter. I followed it until I saw a truck in the distance. It was an old, beat-up thing, but it was my only chance. I ran up to it, waving my arms, praying that whoever was inside would help me. The driver was an older man, looked like a local. He asked me what happened, but I couldn't explain it, couldn't put into words what I had been through. I just begged him to get me out of there, and he did. He drove me to the nearest town, where I finally felt safe. I'd been hiking the Appalachian Trail for a few days, enjoying the solitude. I was somewhere in North Carolina, deep in the woods where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird. It was peaceful, just what I needed. I'd been pushing myself to cover as much ground as possible, so by the time I set up camp that evening, I was exhausted. I hadn't seen anyone all day, which wasn't unusual for this part of the trail. So when I heard someone coming up behind me just as I was setting up my tent, I was a bit startled. He was a hiker, probably in his mid-30s, wearing a worn backpack and a friendly smile. We exchanged the usual small talk, where we were headed, how long we'd been on the trail. He seemed nice enough, but there was something off about him that I couldn't quite place. He mentioned that he hadn't seen many people either and asked if he could camp nearby since it was getting dark. I didn't see a reason to say no, so he set up his tent a short distance away. We had dinner together, sharing stories of past hikes and laughing about the quirks of the trail. But as the night went on, I noticed he was asking a lot of questions: where I was from, who knew I was out here, when I planned to finish my hike. The questions felt a little too personal, but I brushed it off, figuring he was just trying to be friendly. We both turned in early, tired from the day's hike. I fell asleep quickly, but something woke me up in the middle of the night. It was quiet, too quiet. I didn't hear his breathing or the rustling of his sleeping bag. I unzipped my tent and looked over to where he had set up his camp. His tent was gone. The spot where it had been was just an empty patch of flattened grass. I got out of my tent, feeling uneasy. It didn't make sense for him to pack up and leave in the middle of the night without a word. I walked around the area, calling his name, but there was no answer. The air felt heavy, and the darkness seemed thicker than before. I told myself he probably had an emergency and had to leave, but something about the situation just didn't sit right. I tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every little noise made me jump. Eventually, I gave up and just sat there in my tent, waiting for the first light of dawn. When the sun finally came up, I packed my things and decided to head out early. I didn't want to hang around and find out what had happened to the guy. As I started down the trail, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him following me. But the trail was empty, just like before, The woods felt different, felt like they were closing in on me. I walked faster, wanting to put as much distance as possible between me and that campsite. A few miles in, I stopped to take a break. That's when I noticed something odd. My map was missing. I always kept it in the same pocket of my backpack, but it was gone. I searched through all my gear, but it wasn't there. Panic started to set in. Without the map, I wasn't sure which way to go. I knew the trail well enough, but there were a lot of side paths, and I didn't want to get lost. I decided to keep moving forward, sticking to the main trail as best as I could. But the more I walked, the more I started to notice things that didn't make sense. The path seemed different, like it was leading me in circles. I'd see landmarks that I was sure I'd passed earlier, even though I hadn't turned around. It was like the forest was playing tricks on me. Then I found the footprints. At first, I thought they were mine, but as I looked closer, I realized they were too large. Someone had been following me, walking in my tracks. My heart started pounding. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. Whoever it was, they were good at staying hidden. I picked up the pace, trying to put as much distance as I could between me and whoever was out there. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I kept seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. The trail felt endless, like I was getting nowhere. As the day wore on, I came across something that made my blood run cold. It was a piece of fabric caught on a branch, the same color as the shirt the hiker had been wearing. It was torn, like it had been ripped off in a struggle. I felt sick to my stomach. This wasn't just someone messing with me, something bad had happened. I kept moving, refusing to stop even as the sun began to set. I needed to find a way out of the woods, but no matter which direction I went, it all looked the same. The trail markers I'd been following were gone, replaced by nothing but trees and underbrush. I was completely lost, with no idea where I was going. Night fell, and with it came the fear that I wouldn't make it out. I tried to set up camp, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every rustle, every crack of a branch made me jump. I barely slept, too terrified of what might be lurking in the dark. When morning came, I was exhausted but determined to keep going. I couldn't stay in one place, not with whoever was out there watching me. I started walking again, hoping to stumble upon the trail or some sign of civilization. But as the day wore on, I realized I was being herded. Every path I took seemed to lead me back to the same spot, the place where I had found the torn fabric. That's when I saw him. The hiker, standing just inside the tree line, watching me. His face was pale, and there was something wrong with his eyes, like he wasn't really there. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me with that blank expression. I backed away, and as I did, he started to move towards me, slow and deliberate. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I was frozen in place. He got closer, and that's when I saw the knife in his hand, the blade glinting in the fading light. It wasn't just him, there were others too, stepping out from behind the trees, all of them with that same vacant look. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away. The sounds of footsteps behind me pushed me to run faster, but the woods were a maze, and I couldn't find a way out. I tripped over roots and branches, scrambling to keep my footing. Eventually, I burst through the trees and onto a dirt road. I had no idea where it led, but it didn't matter. I ran down it, praying that it would lead me to safety. Behind me, the footsteps faded, but I didn't dare look back. I just kept running until I saw a car coming towards me. I flagged it down, breathless and terrified. The driver was an older man, and when he saw the state I was in, he didn't ask any questions. He just opened the door and told me to get in. As we drove away, I glanced back at the woods, but there was no sign of anyone. I don't know what happened to that hiker or who those other people were. I don't know how I ended up so far off the trail or what they wanted from me. I decided to camp out in a secluded spot in Texas, not far from the border. It was a place I'd been to a few times before, quiet and isolated, perfect for getting away from everything. The only sounds were the wind through the trees and the occasional distant call of some animal. It felt safe, like I was the only person for miles. I set up my tent and got a fire going before the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was clear, and the stars were starting to appear. I felt relaxed, looking forward to a night of peace. But as it got darker, I started to feel like something was off. It was a slight unease, like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I brushed it off, thinking I was just getting spooked by the silence. I'd been out there before and never had any issues. Still, I kept the fire going a little longer than usual, just for some comfort. Eventually, I turned in, zipped up my tent, and tried to get some sleep. It couldn't have been more than an hour later when I heard something. It wasn't loud, just a rustling sound, like someone was moving through the brush nearby. My first thought was that it might be an animal, maybe a deer or something, but the sound was too deliberate, like it was trying to stay quiet. I sat up, listening closely, and that's when I heard it, a low, rough voice. Someone was out there, talking in hushed tones, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. My heart started racing. I was miles from the nearest town, and there shouldn't have been anyone else out there. Then I heard footsteps, slow and careful, coming closer to my tent. I reached for my flashlight, fumbling with the switch, but I didn't turn it on right away. I didn't want to give away my position if whoever was out there didn't know I was in the tent. The footsteps stopped right outside. I held my breath, hoping they'd just move on, but then I heard the zipper of my tent being pulled down. I had no time to react. The flap opened, and a man stepped inside, his face shadowed but his eyes wild. "Don't scream," he said, holding up a hand like that would keep me quiet. He was tall, rough-looking, like he hadn't slept in days. There was dirt on his face and clothes, and I could smell sweat and something else, something metallic, like blood. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I was too scared. He crouched down, still watching me with those wide eyes, and that's when I saw the gun in his hand. It wasn't pointed at me, but it was close enough that I knew I had no chance if he decided to use it. "I need you to help me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "They're after me, and I can't get caught. You're gonna help me get out of here." I didn't know who they were, but I knew arguing wasn't an option. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. He seemed to relax a little, like he'd expected more of a fight. But there was something in his eyes that told me he wasn't stable, like he could snap at any moment. He made me pack up my things quickly, keeping the gun trained on me the whole time. I tried to think of a way out, but every idea felt like it would just get me shot. He was too close, too desperate. When I was done, he told me to lead the way back to my truck. We walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of dirt under our boots. The night felt colder now, and every shadow seemed to hide something dangerous. I kept thinking about what he might do when we got to the truck, whether he'd let me go or if he'd decide I was a liability. When we reached the truck, he told me to get in the driver's seat. He climbed in beside me, the gun resting on his lap. I started the engine, the noise breaking the heavy silence, and he told me to drive. I asked him where, but he just said, "Away from here." I drove, following the dirt road that led back toward the highway. He didn't say much, just kept looking out the window, like he was expecting someone to jump out of the dark and ambush us. The tension in the truck was suffocating, and I could feel sweat running down my back, even though it was cool outside. After a while, he started to talk, more to himself than to me. He said he'd been running for days, that they'd been on his tail since he crossed the border. I didn't ask who they were, didn't want to know. The way he was talking, it was clear he was losing it, paranoia eating away at him. We must have driven for an hour before he told me to pull over. We were on a narrow stretch of road, nothing but trees and scrub on either side. He told me to get out, and I thought that was it, that he was going to shoot me and leave my body in the woods. But instead, he told me to open the back of the truck. I did as he said, my hand shaking so bad I could barely get the latch open. He grabbed my camping gear and tossed it into the woods, then looked at me with those wild eyes again. "Get in," he said, nodding toward the back seat. I hesitated, and his grip on the gun tightened. I got in, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. He climbed into the driver's seat and started the truck, pulling back onto the road. He didn't say anything for a long time, just drove through the night like a man possessed. I didn't know where he was taking me, and I was too scared to ask. Every minute felt like an eternity, the road stretching on forever. Finally, he pulled off onto another dirt road, this one even narrower than the last. It was rough, the truck bouncing over rocks and ruts, and I wondered if he was going to take me somewhere remote to kill me. But he stopped at a clearing, a place where the trees opened up to a view of the stars, and turned off the engine. He sat there for a moment, staring out at the sky, the gun resting loosely in his hand. Then he looked back at me, his eyes calmer but still intense. "You're gonna walk from here," he said. "Just keep going straight, and you'll hit the highway eventually. Don't look back." I didn't need to be told twice. I climbed out of the truck, my legs trembling, and started walking. I could feel his eyes on me, the gun still in his hand, and I didn't dare look back like he said. I just kept moving, one foot in front of the other, praying I'd get out of this alive. I heard the truck start up behind me, the tires crunching on the dirt as he backed up and turned around. I kept walking, not stopping until I heard the sound of the engine fade into the distance. Only then did I collapse, my legs giving out beneath me. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring up at the stars, trying to calm my racing heart. Eventually, I got up and started walking again, not sure where I was going, just needing to keep moving. It took me most of the night, but I finally found the highway, the lights of passing cars a welcome sight. I flagged down a trucker, and he gave me a ride to the nearest town. I didn't tell him what happened, just that I'd gotten lost. I never found out who that man was or what he was running from. I don't think I want to know. All I care about is that I got out alive, and I'll never go camping in a secluded spot like that again. I decided to camp out in the wilderness of Washington State. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, just me in the forest. I'd found a spot near an old, abandoned cabin. The place was pretty run down, but it added to the charm. I figured it would be the perfect spot to set up my tent and have a quiet weekend away from everything. The first night was uneventful. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the distant calls of animals were the only things I heard. It felt good to be away from the noise of the city, and I slept well. The next day, I explored a bit, hiking through the woods and enjoying the solitude. The cabin was in worse shape up close, but I didn't think much of it. It was just an old building, falling apart like so many others in places like this. It wasn't until that evening when things started to feel off. I was sitting by the fire, eating my dinner, when I heard voices. They were faint at first, just murmurs carried on the wind, but they were definitely human. I hadn't seen anyone else out here, so it caught me off guard. I stopped eating, listening carefully, trying to figure out where the voices were coming from. They got louder, and I realized they were coming from the direction of the cabin. I thought maybe it was other campers, but something about the tone of the voices didn't seem right. They were harsh, angry even. I got up and moved closer to the cabin, staying low and quiet. As I got nearer, I could make out what they were saying. There were 3 of them, all men, talking about something that made my blood run cold. They were arguing about money and what to do with some stuff they'd stolen. I heard them mention a robbery that had gone wrong and how they needed to lay low for a while. My heart started pounding. These weren't just random hikers, they were criminals, and I had stumbled right into their hideout. I backed away slowly, trying not to make any noise. I figured if I could just get back to my campsite, I could grab my gear and leave before they noticed me. But as I turned to go, I stepped on a branch, and it snapped loud in the quiet evening air. The voices stopped abruptly, and I knew they'd heard me. I didn't wait to see what they'd do. I ran back to my campsite as fast as I could, my mind racing. I knew I had to get out of there, but I couldn't just leave my gear behind. I grabbed my backpack and started shoving things into it, my hands shaking. I kept glancing toward the cabin, expecting to see them coming any second. Just as I was about to throw my tent into the pack, I heard footsteps crashing through the underbrush. I looked up and saw them, the 3 men from the cabin, running toward me. Their faces were twisted with anger, and one of them was holding a gun. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. They saw me, and the one with the gun raised it, pointing it right at me. "Stop," he shouted. "Don't move." I didn't move. I couldn't. I was too scared to even breathe. The 3 of them closed in around me, circling like wolves. The one with the gun, a tall guy with a scruffy beard, grabbed my backpack and ripped it out of my hands. He dumped it on the ground and started going through it, throwing things aside like they were trash. "What are you doing out here?" one of the other men, a shorter guy with a scar across his cheek, demanded. His voice was low and menacing, like he was used to getting his way. I tried to speak, but my throat was so dry that no sound came out. I'm just camping," I finally managed to say. "I didn't know anyone was here." The guy with the gun looked up at me, his eyes narrow. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice cold. "This is our spot. You're not supposed to be here." I nodded, my mind racing. "I'll leave," I said quickly. "I'll pack up and go right now. I won't say anything to anyone, I swear." The 3 men exchanged looks, and I could tell they weren't sure what to do. The one with the scar looked like he wanted to just get rid of me right then and there, but the 3rd guy, who hadn't said anything yet, spoke up. "Maybe we let her go," he said, his voice softer, almost reasonable. "If she promises to keep quiet." The guy with the gun didn't look convinced. He stared at me for what felt like forever, and I was sure he was going to pull the trigger. But then he lowered the gun slightly, just enough to give me a shred of hope. "Get your stuff and go," he said finally. "But if we ever see you again, you're dead." I didn't need to be told twice. I started packing up as quickly as I could, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold onto anything. The men stood there, watching me like hawks, their eyes cold and hard. I could feel their anger, their frustration, and I knew I was walking a very thin line. It took me only a few minutes to get everything packed, but it felt like hours. Every second, I expected one of them to change his mind and just shoot me. But they didn't. They let me finish, and then the guy with the gun pointed to the trail. "Get out of here," he said. "And remember what I said. Not a word to anyone." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I turned and started walking down the trail, my legs feeling like they might give out any second. I didn't look back. I just kept moving, one foot in front of the other, praying they wouldn't follow me. I walked for what felt like miles, not stopping until I was sure I was far enough away. When I finally did stop, I collapsed on the side of the trail, my whole body shaking. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I was alive, but I knew how close I'd come to not making it out. I kept going after that, not stopping until I reached my car. I threw my gear in the back and got the hell out of there, driving as fast as I could until I was back on the main road. I didn't feel safe until I was miles away, and even then, the fear lingered. I haven't been camping since. The wilderness used to feel like a safe place, a refuge from the chaos of everyday life. But now, it feels different. The thought of being out there alone, with no one around for miles, doesn't bring peace anymore, it brings fear. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces. The guy with the gun, the one with the scar, the quiet one who almost seemed like he had a conscience. I think about how easily things could have gone the other way, how one wrong move could have meant I never made it out of those woods. I've thought about going to the police, telling them what happened, but every time I start to, I hear that man's voice in my head, not a word to anyone. It's like a threat that's still hanging over me, even though I'm hundreds of miles away from that place now. I don't know if they're still out there, hiding out in that cabin, waiting for the next unlucky person to wander too close. I try not to think about it too much, but it's hard. It's like a shadow that follows me around, no matter where I go. Sometimes I wonder if they'll come looking for me, if they'll track me down to make sure I've kept quiet. The fear never really goes away. It just sits there, in the back of my mind, reminding me of how close I came to losing everything. I know one thing for sure, I'll never go back to that part of the woods again. The wilderness is big, and there are plenty of other places to go, but I've learned that no matter how far you go to get away from it all, danger can still find you. I used to love the feeling of being out there, alone with my thoughts, surrounded by nothing but nature. Now, the thought of being alone in the woods just brings back the terror of that night. It's changed me, in ways I'm still trying to understand. I survived, and I'm grateful for that. But I left a part of myself out there in those woods, a part I'm not sure I'll ever get back. All I can do is try to move on, to forget about the cabin and the men who are hiding inside it. But I don't think I'll ever be able to forget. I was driving through a national forest in Oregon, heading to a campsite I'd heard about from a friend. The road was long and winding, with nothing but trees and mountains around me. I was enjoying the solitude, the kind you can only find in the middle of nowhere. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, and I figured I'd be at the site just before dark. That's when I saw him. A guy standing on the side of the road, thumb out, looking for a ride. He looked pretty rough, long hair, scruffy beard, clothes that had seen better days. I usually don't pick up hitchhikers, but something about him seemed, I don't know, desperate, maybe. I figured he was just another traveler, like me, trying to get from one place to another. So, I pulled over. He got in without a word, just nodded in thanks, and we drove on. The silence was heavy at first, but I tried to make some small talk. He told me his name was Luke, and that he was heading in the same direction I was. Said he'd been traveling for a while, just going wherever the road took him. He didn't say much else, and I didn't press him. Something about the way he talked, short, to the point, made me think he wasn't interested in conversation. As we drove, it started getting dark fast. I mentioned I was planning to camp for the night, and that's when he asked if he could join me. I hesitated. It's one thing to give someone a ride, but sharing a campsite with a stranger is different. Still, I didn't want to be rude. Plus, I figured if things got weird, I could always just drive off. So, I said sure. We got to the campsite just as the last light was fading. It was a nice spot, deep in the forest, far from the main road. I set up my tent while Luke watched. He didn't have much with him, just a small backpack. I offered to share my food, and he accepted. We sat by the fire, eating in silence, the flames casting long shadows on the trees around us. After a while, Luke started talking more. He told me about his travels, the places he'd been, the people he'd met. His stories were strange, full of odd details that didn't quite add up. He mentioned how he'd stayed with a group of people out in the desert for a while, but when I asked about them, he got quiet, like he'd said too much. That's when I started to feel uneasy. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. His eyes kept darting around, like he was expecting someone to jump out of the shadows. He asked me strange questions too, if I was traveling alone, if anyone knew where I was, if I had a family. His tone was casual, but the questions felt wrong, like he was probing for something. The more he talked, the more uncomfortable I became. He mentioned a few things that made my skin crawl, how he didn't trust people, how he'd been let down too many times. He said he'd learned not to rely on anyone, that you couldn't count on people to have your back. Then he laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed in the dark. By then, I was on edge. I kept thinking about how isolated we were, how no one would hear me if something went wrong. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. I realized I didn't really know anything about this guy, and I had no idea what he was capable of. As the night went on, Luke's mood shifted. He started pacing around the campsite, muttering to himself. He talked about people who had crossed him, how they'd all paid for it in the end. I didn't like the way he said it, like he was proud of it. He kept looking at me in a way that made my stomach turn, like he was sizing me up. I decided I needed to get out of there. I told Luke I was tired and that I was going to turn in for the night. He didn't respond, just kept pacing. I went into my tent, but I didn't sleep. I lay there, fully dressed, my heart pounding, listening to the sound of him moving around outside. After what felt like hours, everything went quiet. I thought maybe he'd finally gone to sleep, but I didn't trust it. I stayed awake, every muscle tense, waiting for something to happen. And then I heard it, a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the ground. It was close, too close. I peeked out of my tent and saw Luke standing by the fire, his back to me. He was holding something in his hand, something long and sharp, a knife. He was running it along the edge of a log, the blade glinting in the firelight. My blood ran cold. I knew I had to get out of there, but I couldn't just run. He'd hear me, and with that knife. I had to be smart. Quietly, I reached for my keys, which were lying next to me. My hand was shaking so badly I almost dropped them. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and slowly unzipped the tent. I crept out, keeping as low as I could. Luke was still by the fire, his back turned. I moved as quietly as possible, inching toward my car, which was parked a little way off. I kept expecting him to turn around, to come after me, but he didn't. Finally, I reached the car. I unlocked it as quietly as I could, slipped inside, and started the engine. The noise cut through the night like a gunshot, and I saw Luke whip around, his eyes wild. I slammed the car into gear and tore out of there, not caring about the rough terrain or the branches scraping against the sides. I just wanted to get away. I drove for miles, not stopping until I was sure I was far enough away. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the car on the road. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see Luke coming after me, but the road was empty. I finally pulled over at a small gas station, my heart still racing. I sat there for a long time, just trying to calm down. I couldn't believe how close I'd come to. I don't even want to think about it. All I know is that I'm never picking up a hitchhiker again. That night could have ended very differently, and I'm just glad I made it out. I don't know what Luke's story was, but I'm sure of one thing: whatever he was hiding, it was dark, and I'm lucky I didn't stick around to find out just how dark. I've always liked camping alone. It's peaceful, you know? Just you in the forest, away from everything. So, when I decided to take a weekend trip to a forest in Minnesota, I didn't think twice about going alone. I packed light, just the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, some food, and my knife. The forest was dense, the trees thick and towering. It was perfect, exactly what I needed to clear my head. The first day was great. I set up my tent near a small clearing, close to a stream. The sound of the water was calming, and I spent the day exploring the area, taking pictures, and just enjoying the solitude. By the time the sun started to set, I was ready to relax by the fire with a book. The evening was quiet, with only the sounds of the forest around me. I felt completely at ease. It wasn't until late that night, after I had crawled into my sleeping bag, that I first felt uneasy. I was drifting off when I thought I heard something like footsteps, but soft, almost hesitant. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and tried to go back to sleep. But the feeling stayed with me, this nagging sense that something wasn't right. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling a little on edge, but brushed it off. I figured I was just getting spooked by being alone in the woods. I went about my day, hiking further into the forest, trying to shake off the weird feeling from the night before. But the further I went, the more uneasy I became. It felt like I was being watched. Every time I stopped, I had the urge to look over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something there. By late afternoon, I decided to head back to my campsite, but I took a different route, a longer one. I thought maybe it was just my imagination, and I was overreacting. But as I walked, I heard it again, those soft footsteps, following at a distance. I stopped abruptly, hoping to catch whoever or whatever it was, but the sound stopped too. My heart was pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, keeping pace with me. When I got back to my campsite, it was almost dark. I tried to keep calm, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I built up the fire higher than usual, trying to push back the growing darkness. I decided I wouldn't sleep that night. Instead, I'd keep watch, just in case. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, listening to the sounds of the forest. Hours passed, and nothing happened. I started to think maybe I was just being ridiculous. But then, in the dead of night, I heard it again, those same footsteps, but this time, they were closer. Much closer. I stood up, straining to see beyond the firelight, but there was nothing. Just darkness and the shadows of the trees. I called out, trying to sound brave, but my voice cracked. "Who's there?" I waited, but no answer came, just silence. Then I saw it, a figure, just at the edge of the firelight, barely visible. A man, standing still, watching me. My blood ran cold. I could barely make out his face, but I could see he was grinning, this twisted, menacing grin that made my skin crawl. He didn't say anything, just stood there, like he was daring me to do something. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I grabbed my pack and bolted into the woods, not caring about leaving my tent or supplies behind. I just needed to get away. I ran blindly through the trees, not caring where I was going, just trying to put as much distance between me and that man as possible. My heart was racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I didn't stop. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I had to stop to catch my breath. I was deep in the forest now, far from the campsite, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still following me. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but everything looked the same, just endless trees in every direction. Then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I knew I couldn't keep going blindly. I had to think. I spotted a thick patch of bushes nearby and quickly ducked into them, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I held my breath, listening as the footsteps got closer, then stopped right near where I was hiding. I could see his boots through the leaves, just a few feet away. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, just waiting. I was terrified he'd hear my heartbeat. It was pounding so hard. Then, slowly, he started to move again, but he didn't go far. He was searching, methodically, like he knew I was close. I knew I couldn't stay there. He would find me eventually. I waited until he moved a little further away, then quietly slipped out of the bushes and started creeping in the opposite direction. I moved slowly, carefully, trying to keep from making any noise. Every snap of a twig underfoot made my heart skip a beat. The forest was pitch dark now, and I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I kept moving, not daring to use my flashlight. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to keep moving. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan, but all I could think about was that man, his twisted grin, and how he was still out there, somewhere, hunting me. I came across a small stream and decided to follow it, hoping it would lead me to a road or somewhere safe. I moved as quickly as I could, the sound of the water masking my footsteps. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see him right behind me, but there was nothing. Just the dark woods and the sound of the stream. I followed the stream for what felt like hours, my legs aching, exhaustion starting to take over. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let him catch up to me. Finally, I saw a break in the trees ahead, and my heart leaped. I had found a dirt road. I hurried up to it, looking both ways, trying to decide which direction to go. I chose the way that seemed to lead downhill, hoping it would take me to some sort of civilization. I started walking, faster now, almost jogging, desperate to find help. The road was empty, no sign of anyone. But then I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, now on the road behind me. He had found me. I broke into a full sprint, my fear giving me a burst of energy. I didn't dare look back, just focused on the road ahead, praying I would see headlights or a house, anything. The footsteps were getting closer, and I could hear him now, his breathing heavy, like he was enjoying the chase. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, but I forced myself to keep going. Then, up ahead, I saw a faint light through the trees. A house. I ran toward it, screaming for help, hoping someone was home. I reached the house just as I heard him right behind me. I banged on the door, screaming, desperate. The door opened, and an older man stood there, confused and alarmed. I pushed past him, slamming the door shut and locking it. I could barely speak, trying to explain what was happening. The man grabbed his phone and called the police while I collapsed on the floor, trembling, trying to catch my breath. I heard footsteps outside, but the man turned on the porch light and grabbed a rifle from a closet. He stepped outside, and for a moment, I thought he might have to use it, but then I heard nothing. Just silence. He came back in, locking the door behind him. The police arrived a few minutes later, but by then, whoever was out there had disappeared into the night. I stayed with that man and his wife until morning, too scared to go back out into the woods. The police searched the area but found no sign of the man who had chased me. They said it was probably just some drifter, but I knew better. There was something wrong with that man, something dangerous. I'd been hiking through the back country of Utah for 3 days, just me in the open wilderness. It was exactly what I needed, a break from everything, some time to clear my head. The landscape was beautiful, the kind of place where you could get lost in your thoughts and forget the world. But on that third day, things changed. I'd been following a trail that wasn't really a trail, more like a path that animals or other hikers had worn into the ground. It led me into a small valley, surrounded by rocky hills. That's when I saw it, a campsite, or what was left of one. At first, I was relieved. It meant people had been here recently, maybe I'd even run into them. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The tent was still there, half collapsed, with some gear scattered around. But there was no sign of anyone. The campfire had long gone cold, just a pile of ashes and charred wood. What really got me, though, was the blood. There were dark stains on the ground, just outside the tent, like someone had been hurt bad. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding. This wasn't right. I looked around, hoping to see someone. Maybe they'd just gone off to find help or something. But there was nothing, no footprints leading away, no sounds except the wind rustling through the brush. The more I looked, the worse it got. There were drag marks in the dirt, like someone had been pulled away from the camp. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but it was all right there in front of me. I knew I needed to leave, to get out of there and find help. But as I turned to head back the way I came, I heard voices, low and muffled, coming from somewhere nearby. My stomach twisted. Whoever had been here, they weren't far. And from the sound of it, they were coming back. I didn't know what to do. Running seemed like the worst idea, like it would just make noise and draw attention. But staying put wasn't much better. I moved as quietly as I could, slipping behind a large rock near the campsite, trying to stay out of sight. The voices got louder, clearer. Two men, arguing about something. I couldn't make out the words, but they didn't sound happy. Then I saw them, two guys, rough-looking, the kind you wouldn't want to mess with. They were carrying shovels and bags, and when they got to the campsite, they stopped dead, looking around like they were expecting someone. One of them pointed at the tent, and the other cursed under his breath. They knew something was wrong, that someone had been there. I held my breath, trying to stay as still as possible. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get out of this. The men started talking again, louder this time, angry. They were talking about the blood, about how they needed to cover it up before anyone else saw it. That's when it hit me, they were the ones who did this. Whoever had been camping here, these guys had done something to them, and now they were back to clean it up. I knew I had to move, to get away before they spotted me. But I was terrified that any movement would give me away. The men started digging, right there by the bloodstains, like they were getting ready to bury something or someone. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they'd hear it. I slowly backed away, trying to keep the rock between me and them. I didn't get far before I stepped on a twig. The snap was like a gunshot in the quiet valley. The men froze, then whipped around, looking right in my direction. I ducked down, hoping they didn't see me. But I knew they had. One of them dropped his shovel and started walking toward me, slowly, like he was hunting. I couldn't stay there. I had to run. I got up and bolted, not caring about the noise anymore, just focused on getting away. I heard the guy shout, and then both of them were after me. I could hear their footsteps pounding behind me, getting closer. I ran as fast as I could, weaving through the trees, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away. The terrain was rough, and I nearly twisted my ankle more than once, but I couldn't stop. The voices were getting closer, the men shouting at each other to spread out, to cut me off. I knew they were serious. If they caught me, they weren't going to let me go. I came to a steep hill and half slid, half ran down it, hoping the incline would slow them down. At the bottom was a dry creek bed, and I followed it, thinking maybe it would lead me to safety. But the creek bed was rocky and uneven, and I was getting tired. My legs were burning, my lungs felt like they were going to explode, but I couldn't stop. I heard one of the men yell that he'd found something, a boot print, my boot print. They were close, too close. I pushed myself harder, scrambling over rocks and through bushes, not caring about the cuts and scrapes. I just needed to get out of there, to find a way back to the main trail or some kind of help. The creek bed led me to a small ravine, and I took a chance, climbing up the side, hoping it would throw them off. At the top, I found myself in another part of the forest, the trees thicker here, the underbrush denser. I kept going, forcing my way through, not daring to look back. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, the sounds of pursuit started to fade. The voices were more distant, the footsteps harder to hear. I kept going until I was sure they weren't behind me anymore. Then I collapsed against a tree, trying to catch my breath, trying to think. I was lost, deep in the forest with no idea which way to go. But I couldn't stay there. I had to keep moving, to find the main trail or some sign of civilization. I started walking again, slower now, trying to stay quiet, listening for any sign that they were still after me. It felt like hours passed, the sun starting to dip low in the sky. I was exhausted, my whole body aching, but I couldn't rest. I finally found what looked like a path, more like a game trail, but it was something. I followed it, hoping it would lead me out. Eventually, I heard it, the distant sound of cars. I nearly cried with relief. I followed the sound, and it led me to a road, a small, two-lane highway that cut through the forest. I stumbled out onto the asphalt, looking both ways, praying for a car to come by. It didn't take long. A truck appeared over the hill, and I waved it down, desperate. The driver, an older guy, looked at me like I was crazy, but he stopped. I climbed into the passenger seat, barely able to speak, just mumbling about needing help, about the men in the woods. He took me to the nearest town, where I finally found some sense of safety. The police were called, and I told them everything about the campsite, the blood, the men chasing me. They took it seriously, but when they went back to check, there was nothing there. No sign of the men, no sign of the campsite, like it had all been cleaned up. I don't know who those men were or what they were doing out there, but I know I'm lucky to be alive. I haven't gone back to the wilderness since, and I don't think I ever will. I had always wanted to explore the Everglades, so when I finally had the chance, I was thrilled. The vast wetlands, the wildlife, it all seemed so intriguing. I planned to spend a weekend there, camping and hiking. When I arrived at the park, the ranger at the entrance gave me a quick rundown of the rules. One thing he emphasized was staying within the marked trails and boundaries. He didn't explain why, just said it was important for my safety. I thought it was just a precaution, maybe to avoid wildlife or difficult terrain. I assured him I'd stick to the trails and thanked him before heading off. The first day was everything I hoped for: peaceful, beautiful, and full of wildlife. I followed the marked paths, taking in the sights and sounds of the Everglades. The second day, I decided to try a new route, one that seemed to be a less traveled path on the map. It was still within the boundaries, or so I thought. As the day wore on, I became more adventurous, straying further from the main trail. The vegetation grew denser, and the area felt more isolated. It was exhilarating at first, but soon I started feeling uneasy. I tried to push the feeling aside, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the area. But the unease grew when I noticed the silence. There were no birds, no animal sounds, just an eerie quiet. I stopped to check my map and realized I had wandered farther than I intended. The trails I was on didn't match up with the map's markings. I turned around, hoping to retrace my steps, but then I saw something that made my heart sink. I came across a campfire, still smoldering, with discarded food and empty cans around it. The fire looked recent, and the area was disturbingly neat. It wasn't a park ranger's campsite, it was something far less official. The realization hit me hard. I wasn't alone. I started walking faster, my anxiety spiking. As I moved, I heard voices, faint but unmistakable. They were coming from deeper in the woods. I tried to listen, but the voices were too muffled to make out clearly. Then, I saw them, 3 men, emerging from behind a cluster of trees. They were dressed in camouflage, carrying rifles and gear that looked more suited for illegal hunting than a nature walk. My heart raced. These men weren't park rangers. They were poachers. I froze, not knowing what to do. My mind raced through the possible scenarios, none of them good. The men were talking amongst themselves, their voices carrying through the woods. They didn't seem to notice me at first, but that wouldn't last. I had to find cover and get out of there. I spotted a dense patch of bushes and ducked behind them, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I could hear the men getting closer, their conversation growing louder. I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't spot me. I could hear one of them mention something about getting rid of anyone who finds out. I was terrified. I needed to get back to the main trail, but the path I had taken was now a maze of unfamiliar terrain. I had no idea where I was or how to get back. The poachers were moving around, their footsteps getting closer to where I was hiding. I waited, praying they would move on. After what felt like an eternity, they seemed to walk away, their voices fading. I stayed hidden for a few more minutes to be sure. When I finally felt it was safe, I slowly crawled out of the bushes and tried to find my way back. I was disoriented and scared, but I knew I had to keep moving. I followed the direction I thought was back to the main trail, making sure to stay as quiet as possible. The Everglades, usually so inviting, now felt like a labyrinth designed to trap me. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept my eyes peeled for any sign of the poachers. The dense vegetation made it hard to see very far, and I had to push through thick brush and overgrown paths. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees. I was exhausted, and my anxiety was through the roof. I finally spotted a familiar landmark, a large cypress tree I had seen earlier. Relief washed over me. I was on the right path. I hurried towards the trail, hoping that I wasn't too far off course. As I got closer, I saw the ranger station's lights in the distance. I picked up my pace, driven by the fear of what could still be out there. I reached the station just as it was getting dark. The ranger was still there, and I ran up to him, breathless and shaking. I told him everything, how I had wandered off, how I had encountered the poachers, and how I had barely escaped. He listened carefully, his expression growing more serious with every word. He immediately called for additional rangers and law enforcement to check out the area. They would be able to track down the poachers and hopefully ensure they wouldn't be a threat to others. I was relieved but still rattled. I had come so close to danger and had barely managed to escape. The ranger made sure I was safe and offered to escort me back to my campsite. I was too shaken to refuse. As we walked back, I looked around the Everglades with new eyes, aware of how easily something could go wrong in such an isolated place. When we reached my campsite, I packed up quickly. I didn't want to stay another night, not after what had happened. The ranger made sure everything was all right before I left. I drove out of the Everglades as quickly as I could, not stopping until I was safely away from that place. I haven't been back to the Everglades since. I had been looking forward to my camping trip in the Pacific Northwest for weeks. I planned to spend a few days alone, enjoying the peace and quiet of the wilderness. I set up my tent in a secluded spot, built a campfire, and cooked myself a simple dinner. Everything was perfect as night fell and the forest went silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. I turned in early that night, exhausted from hiking all day. I slept soundly, wrapped up in my sleeping bag, the warmth from the fire keeping the chill away. It was around 2 a.m. when I was jolted awake. I heard a rustling sound, but it wasn't coming from outside the tent. It was closer, like someone moving around near my campfire. My heart pounded as I lay still, trying to make sense of the noise. I slowly unzipped the tent and peered outside. The firelight flickered and cast eerie shadows across the clearing. And there, sitting by the fire, was a man I didn't recognize. He was just staring into the flames, as if waiting for me to notice him. I froze, not sure what to do. The man looked calm and collected, but something about the scene didn't sit right with me. I reached for my phone, which was charging by my backpack, but before I could grab it, the man stood up and turned towards me. His face was partially illuminated by the firelight, and I could see he was wearing a worn-out jacket and had a scruffy beard. "Hey there," he called out, his voice steady and unnervingly polite. "Didn't mean to wake you." I didn't respond immediately. My mind raced, trying to piece together how he had arrived without me hearing him. My camping spot was in a remote area, far from any trails or roads. I should have been alone. "Mind if I sit here for a while?" he asked, gesturing to the other side of the fire. He didn't wait for a reply. He just sat down, making himself comfortable. I slowly got out of my tent, trying to act calm, though my hands were shaking. "How did you find this spot?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady. The man looked at me with a disarming smile. "Oh, I've been around these parts before. Just thought I'd come over and say hi." I wanted to ask more questions, but something in his demeanor made me uneasy. He seemed too relaxed, too comfortable for someone who had just stumbled upon a stranger's campsite. I decided to keep my distance and made sure my phone was within reach, just in case. The man's smile slowly faded, replaced by a serious expression. "You know," he said, his tone shifting, "it's not very safe to camp out here alone. Especially with folks like me around." I felt a chill run down my spine. I was alone, and he had a way of making me feel vulnerable and exposed. I tried to stay composed, but my mind was racing through possible escape routes. I looked around, hoping to spot any signs of other people or a way to get help, but the forest was silent and dark. "Why don't you just leave?" I suggested, my voice firmer than I felt. "I'd like some privacy." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Oh, I don't think that's going to happen. See, I've been watching you for a while now. Figured I'd make my presence known." My heart raced even faster. I wanted to run, but the man had positioned himself between me and the direction of my car. I had no idea what his intentions were, but I knew I had to think quickly. I reached into my bag for my bear spray, something I carried as a precaution. The man's eyes followed my movement, and his smile returned, but it was no longer reassuring. "Careful with that. You wouldn't want to make me angry." I tried to stay calm. "What do you want from me?" He leaned back, looking thoughtful. Just wanted to see what kind of person you are. And now that I've seen, I think it's time for you to leave. I knew I needed to find a way to get out of this situation. My mind raced through options. I considered making a run for it, but the man seemed to anticipate my every move. I decided to try to distract him instead. I can give you some cash, I said, trying to buy time. If that's what you want. The man's gaze sharpened. I'm not interested in your money. Just your company. The situation was getting more dangerous by the minute. I noticed a small, pointed rock near the edge of the clearing. If I could reach it without drawing his attention, I might be able to use it to defend myself or create a distraction. I started talking to him, trying to keep his focus on me. So, what's your story? Why are you out here? He seemed to relax, talking about random things, his life, his travels. It was clear he was trying to keep me calm, but his eyes never left mine. I seized the opportunity to quietly edge toward the rock. When I was close enough, I grabbed it and held it behind my back. The man didn't seem to notice. I carefully moved toward my car, trying to keep the conversation going. I had to stay focused, not letting my fear show. Well, I said, trying to sound as casual as possible, it's getting late. Maybe you should head out. The man's expression grew colder. I don't think so. I'm not finished here. At that moment, I made a split-second decision. I threw the rock as hard as I could towards the trees, creating a loud noise. The man's head snapped in that direction, giving me the chance I needed. I dashed toward my car, fumbling with the keys. As I got the door open and jumped inside, I could hear the man shouting behind me. I started the engine and sped out of the campsite, not looking back. My heart pounded as I drove away, the forest dark and intimidating around me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I found a motel and checked in, my hands still shaking as I explained my situation to the clerk. I called the local authorities and reported what had happened. The next morning, I returned to the area with the authorities. They conducted a search but found no sign of the man. I was told they'd keep an eye out, but I never heard if they found him or if he was even reported in the area before. I've since avoided camping alone in remote places, always making sure I have company or a safe way to leave if things go wrong. I had planned this trip for months. The Boundary Waters in Minnesota was supposed to be a tranquil escape. The vast, unspoiled landscape and the peaceful solitude were exactly what I needed. I had everything packed, set up my campsite near the edge of a small lake, and spent the first day just soaking in the scenery. It was a beautiful evening. I made a fire, cooked some dinner, and admired the view as the sun set. I had my tent set up a little away from the fire, trying to get a good night's sleep before the next day's hike. Everything felt perfect until the sounds began. I was already in my tent, trying to drift off when I heard voices. They were faint at first, and I thought it might be someone else camping. But then, I heard something that made me sit up. It sounded like multiple people talking, but not in a friendly way. Their voices were low and urgent. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was clear they were close. I poked my head out of the tent, trying to see where the noise was coming from. The campfire was now just embers, and the darkness was thick. The voices were definitely coming from the direction of the lake, but I couldn't see anyone. I decided to stay put and listen. After a while, the voices stopped, and all I could hear was the gentle lapping of the water. I thought maybe it was just my imagination or other campers who had left. I tried to sleep again, but the tension made it impossible. Then, around midnight, I heard a loud splash. I jolted awake and listened intently. I heard shuffling and low voices again, much closer now. I took a deep breath and unzipped my tent just a little. I peered out and saw a small group of people, maybe 4 or 5, gathered near the lake. Their voices were harsh and clipped. I saw that they were loading large bags into a small boat, and they were moving quickly. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but their presence made me uneasy. I quietly zipped my tent back up and tried to think of what to do. I knew I had to get out of there, but I had to be careful not to alert them. I decided to pack up as quietly as possible and move to another campsite further away. I started gathering my things, trying to make as little noise as I could. As I was packing, I heard one of them say something about the witness. My heart skipped a beat. It dawned on me that they might have seen me or figured out that someone was around. I had to act fast. With my gear packed, I tried to leave my campsite as quietly as possible. I had no idea where I was going, just that I needed to get away. I started walking towards the direction I thought was the closest trail. I had just made it to the edge of the trees when I heard footsteps behind me. I froze, listening. The footsteps were slow and deliberate. I crouched down, trying to stay hidden. The sound of the footsteps got closer, and then I heard voices again, this time louder and angrier. I could barely make out their words, but they were clearly searching for me. I waited, holding my breath. The voices grew louder and closer. I realized they were heading in the direction of my old campsite. I decided to make a run for it. I picked a random direction and moved as quietly and quickly as I could. The forest was dense, and I kept hitting branches and stumbling over roots. I hoped they wouldn't hear me or follow my trail. I ran for what felt like hours, though it was probably only about 30 minutes. I finally found a small clearing and stopped to catch my breath. I looked around and saw nothing but trees and darkness. I was exhausted and scared, but knew I had to keep moving. I eventually found a spot where I could hide and set up a temporary shelter. It wasn't much, just some branches and leaves, but it would have to do for the night. I hoped that by morning, the smugglers would be gone and I could find my way back to safety. The rest of the night was tense. I barely slept, constantly listening for any signs of the group. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up and started moving again, making sure to stay as quiet as possible. I eventually stumbled upon a hiking trail and followed it, hoping it would lead me to a more populated area. After a few hours of walking, I finally saw other people, hikers and campers. I approached them and told them what happened. They contacted the authorities, and I gave them all the information I had. The local rangers took my report seriously and started a search in the area. I stayed with the group of campers until the authorities could escort me out. I never heard what happened to the smugglers or if they were caught. The experience left me shaken, and I decided to stick to more populated areas for my future trips. It's hard to describe how frightening it was to realize that I had stumbled upon something dangerous and that I was the one they were looking for. The Boundary Waters is a beautiful place, but it's also a reminder of how easily things can go wrong when you least expect it. I was fortunate to get out safely, and I hope no one else has to face what I did. I decided to take a solo camping trip in a national park in Virginia. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape, away from the chaos of everyday life. I arrived at the park, found a secluded spot, and set up my camp. The first couple of days went smoothly. The park was beautiful, and I enjoyed the solitude. On the third day, while I was gathering firewood, I found something odd. It was a small, black object partially buried under a pile of leaves near my campsite. I picked it up and realized it was a tiny camera, one of those things you might see used for wildlife monitoring. It had a lens and a few wires sticking out. It didn't look like it belonged to the Park Service. I felt a chill. My initial thought was that someone might have left it behind accidentally, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was placed there intentionally. I decided to check my campsite more carefully. I looked around but didn't find anything else unusual. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was probably nothing. That night, I kept my campsite well lit and stayed close to the fire. I was on edge but tried to focus on the tranquility of the forest around me. I kept thinking about the camera and wondered if someone had been watching me. The next day, I found myself constantly glancing around, feeling like I was being watched. I decided to check the area more thoroughly. I found a small path leading away from my campsite that I hadn't noticed before. I followed it cautiously, keeping an eye out for anything out of place. The path led to a small, overgrown area that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I spotted another camera, similar to the first one, hidden in the bushes. My heart raced as I realized someone had been monitoring me closely. I took a deep breath and tried to think clearly. I decided to find where the cameras might be transmitting to. I knew this could be risky, but I needed to find out who was behind this. I searched around and eventually found a small, makeshift shelter hidden among the trees. It had a few old blankets and some food wrappers. Then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were several more cameras set up in various spots around the area, all pointing towards my campsite. Whoever was watching me had been very thorough in setting this up. I started to feel a growing sense of dread. The realization that someone had been observing me for days, possibly planning something, was terrifying. I knew I needed to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I hurried back to my campsite and packed up my gear as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking as I folded up my tent and gathered my things. I was just about to finish when I heard a twig snap behind me. I turned around and saw a man standing at the edge of the clearing. He was dressed in old, worn clothes and had a rugged look about him. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with a strange, unsettling calmness. I tried to keep my voice steady and asked him if he was lost. He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer. I could see that he was holding a large, rusted knife. My heart pounded in my chest. I backed away slowly, trying not to provoke him. He started to advance towards me. I had no choice but to make a run for it. I grabbed my backpack and ran down the path I had used earlier. I could hear him following me, his footsteps growing louder behind me. I ran as fast as I could, navigating through the dense underbrush. My legs were burning, and I stumbled several times, but I kept going. I needed to get to a place where I could find help. Eventually, I emerged onto a more traveled trail. I saw other hikers in the distance and ran towards them, calling out for help. The man following me didn't come out of the woods. I felt a moment of relief but knew I wasn't safe yet. I explained the situation to the park rangers who were patrolling the area. They took my report seriously and immediately started searching for the man and the cameras. I was escorted back to the park entrance and given a ride to a nearby town. The authorities searched the area thoroughly but didn't find the man or any additional cameras. They said they would keep an eye out for any reports of suspicious activity in the park. I was relieved to be safe but unsettled by the experience. I decided to cut my trip short and go back home. I was camping alone in the Adirondacks, just a solo trip to clear my mind. It wasn't my first time out there by myself, so I wasn't too worried about anything happening. I had my tent set up in a small clearing, not too far from a stream, and I was looking forward to a quiet night. The weather was good, the air was cool, and I had everything I needed. I spent most of the day hiking around, taking photos, and just enjoying the peace. There wasn't another soul around, which is exactly how I liked it. By late afternoon, I made it back to my campsite, cooked up some dinner, and settled in for the night. As the sun started to set, I built a small fire and sat by it, listening to the sounds of the forest. Everything felt normal. That's when I heard something in the distance, footsteps on the trail. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, but as the sound got closer, I realized it was someone walking. I stood up, a little uneasy, and watched as a man came into view. He was stumbling a bit, looking rough like he hadn't slept or eaten in days. His clothes were dirty, and his face was covered in scrapes and bruises. He spotted me and started to wave, calling out for help. He said he'd been lost for days, that he couldn't find his way back to the trailhead. He looked so desperate that I couldn't just turn him away, even though something about the situation felt off. I offered him some food and water, which he took like he was starving. He kept thanking me, saying he didn't know what he would have done if he hadn't found me. As the sky darkened, I asked him where he was headed, but he was vague, saying he'd been hiking and got turned around. The whole time, he was jittery, looking around like he was expecting something. I started to feel uneasy. He wasn't acting like someone who'd just been lost, more like someone who was hiding from something. I told him he could stay by the fire for the night, but I was already planning on how to get rid of him in the morning. He kept talking, asking me questions about where I'd come from, how long I'd been out there, but he never really answered any of my questions. I started to get the feeling he wasn't lost at all, like maybe he'd been out there for a different reason. The fire was burning low, and I was getting ready to head into my tent when he asked if I had any extra blankets. I gave him one, and he just sat there, staring into the flames, muttering to himself. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but it didn't sound right. It was like he was talking to someone who wasn't there. I decided to go into my tent, but I didn't feel safe sleeping with him out there. I lay in my tent, listening to the crackle of the fire and his quiet murmuring. Every now and then, I hear him move around, shifting in his spot. I couldn't relax, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't know if he was dangerous, but I knew I wasn't going to get any sleep with him out there. Around midnight, the fire died down completely, and it got real quiet. Too quiet. I strained to listen, trying to figure out if he was still outside, but I couldn't hear anything. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a rustling right next to my tent. My heart skipped a beat. I held my breath, hoping it was just the wind or an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Suddenly, there was a tug on the side of my tent, like someone was trying to open it. I froze, not knowing what to do. The zipper started to move, slowly, like whoever was out there was trying not to make any noise. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to defend myself, but all I had was a small camping knife, nothing that would do much good if it came to a fight. I grabbed the knife and held it tight, my hand shaking. The zipper stopped, and there was silence again. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud in my ears, but nothing else. Then, just when I thought maybe he'd gone away, I heard him speak, real quiet, almost a whisper. "I know you're awake," he said. His voice was low, and there was something off about it, like he was enjoying this. "I've been watching you." I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just some lost hiker. He'd been out there the whole time, watching me, waiting for the right moment. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew I had to get out of there. Slowly, I reached for my phone, trying not to make a sound. I didn't want to alert him that I was moving. Before I could do anything, the tent suddenly shook violently, like he was trying to rip it open. I panicked, kicking out with my feet, hoping to knock him off balance. I could hear him grunt, and then the tent collapsed on top of me as he pulled on it from outside. I was trapped inside, tangled in the fabric, but I managed to find the zipper and claw my way out. I burst out of the tent, knife in hand, ready to defend myself, but he was gone. The campsite was empty, no sign of him anywhere. I looked around, my eyes darting to every shadow, every tree, expecting him to jump out at any moment. But all I heard was the wind in the trees and the distant call of an owl. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my backpack, leaving most of my gear behind, and started running down the trail. I didn't care where I was going, just that I needed to get away from him. My legs were burning, and I was out of breath, but I kept going, adrenaline pushing me forward. Every time I looked back, I expected to see him following me, but there was nothing. Just the dark forest closing in around me. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, finally collapsing against a tree, gasping for air. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what had just happened, what he wanted, and why he let me go. I stayed there for hours, too scared to move, too scared to go back. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I finally started walking again, heading in the direction I thought would lead me back to the main trail. It took me most of the day, but I eventually found my way out of the forest. I went straight to the nearest ranger station and told them everything. They sent out a search party, but they didn't find him. No trace of the man, no sign of my tent or the campsite, nothing. It was like he'd never been there, like it was all in my head. But I know what happened. I know he was real. I was hiking alone in the wilderness in Montana. I'd done it before, nothing too serious, just some trails and camping to get away from everything. It was supposed to be a week to clear my head, be alone with nature, and enjoy the quiet. It was the third day when I wandered off the main trail, looking for a good spot to set up camp. I thought I'd found a nice, secluded area by a small stream, far from any other hikers. As I was setting up my tent, I heard something that didn't fit with the usual forest sounds. It was a muffled voice, low and strained, coming from somewhere nearby. I stopped what I was doing and listened. The voice was faint but unmistakably human. I felt uneasy but decided to check it out. Maybe someone was hurt or lost. I followed the sound, creeping through the trees, careful not to make too much noise. The voice grew louder, and I could make out a second voice, deeper and rougher. I crouched behind a thick bush and peered through the branches. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a man, standing over someone tied to a tree. The person tied up was a woman, maybe in her mid-30s, with duct tape over her mouth and her hands bound behind her back. She was sobbing, shaking her head, while the man leaned in close, whispering something I couldn't hear. He had a knife in his hand, and he was playing with it, running the blade across the woman's cheek, just enough to scare her without cutting. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. If I ran, he might hear me, and if I stayed, I might be caught. I couldn't just leave her there, though. I had to do something. I decided to back away slowly, thinking I could get to my pack, grab my phone, and call for help. But as I took a step back, I snapped a twig under my boot. The man's head whipped around, and his eyes locked onto mine. For a split second, we just stared at each other. Then he started moving toward me, fast. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noise anymore. I could hear him behind me, getting closer. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. There was no one else around, no help nearby, and my car was miles away. I had nothing but the clothes on my back and a small pocket knife, hardly a match for what he was carrying. I spotted a cluster of boulders up ahead and ducked behind them, trying to catch my breath and think. The footsteps behind me slowed, and I could hear him walking, searching, talking in a low, taunting voice. Come out, wherever you are," he called, his voice dripping with malice. "You shouldn't have seen that. Now we have to play." I stayed as quiet as I could, crouching low, trying to make myself as small as possible. I was praying he wouldn't find me, that he'd get bored and go back to the woman. But deep down, I knew he wouldn't. He had a sick game in mind, and I was the new target. The footsteps came closer, and I could see his boots through the gaps in the rocks. He was right there, just a few feet away. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he'd hear it. But then, he walked past, still searching, still talking to me like I was a child hiding in a game of hide and seek. When I couldn't hear him anymore, I took the chance to move. I crawled on my hands and knees, staying low, trying to put as much distance between us as I could. I needed to find a way out of this, a way to get to safety or help. But every direction I looked seemed to lead deeper into the forest, away from any chance of rescue. I made it to a small clearing and spotted something glinting in the dirt. It was an old, rusted trap, probably left by some hunter years ago. The sight of it gave me an idea, a desperate, crazy idea, but it was all I had. I carefully pried the trap open and positioned it near a narrow path that led back toward where I'd left my gear. Then, I doubled back, moving as quietly as I could, hoping to circle around behind him. I had no real plan beyond getting the woman free and trying to escape together. But as I crept closer to where I'd last seen him, I realized he was waiting for me. He grabbed me from behind, yanking me off my feet, the knife pressed against my throat. "Clever girl," he hissed in my ear, his breath hot and rancid. But not clever enough. He dragged me back toward the campsite where the woman was tied, and I struggled, kicking and thrashing, but he was too strong. When we got back, he shoved me to the ground next to the woman. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, and I felt a wave of guilt. I'd only made things worse for both of us. He stood over us, knife in hand, grinning like he'd already won. "Now," he said, "how about we make this interesting? I'll give you a head start, 10 seconds, before I come after you. But only one of you gets to leave." I realized he was going to make us run, make us choose who would survive. It was a sick, twisted game, and there was no way to win. But I wasn't about to let him have the satisfaction. I had one last trick up my sleeve, and I prayed it would work. I glanced at the woman, then back at him, and nodded. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But let her go first." He laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "Nice try. But you're both running. Now, go." He stepped back, giving us space to get up. I helped the woman to her feet, my mind racing, looking for any chance to get out of this alive. Then, with a final look at him, I grabbed the woman's arm and bolted in the direction of the trap. He didn't give us the full 10 seconds. I could hear him coming after us almost immediately, his footsteps pounding the ground behind us. I pushed the woman ahead, urging her to run faster, not letting her stop. We reached the narrow path, and I swerved to the side, pulling her with me. We kept running, not looking back, until we heard a sharp, metallic snap followed by a scream of pain. I stopped, breathless, and turned around. He'd stepped right into the trap. The rusted metal had clamped down on his leg, and he was struggling to free himself, his face twisted in agony. I didn't wait to see if he'd get out. I grabbed the woman's hand and we ran, faster than before, not stopping until we reached the main trail. We didn't speak, just kept moving until we finally saw a group of hikers coming toward us. They helped us, called the authorities, and stayed with us until we were safe. The police found the man still stuck in the trap. He was arrested, and we later learned that he'd been wanted for several attacks in the area. I never went back to that part of the wilderness again. I still love camping, but now I'm always on edge, always looking over my shoulder, knowing that danger can come out of nowhere when you least expect it. I was out in the Smoky Mountains, just me and the trail, trying to get away from the city and clear my head. I've always liked hiking alone. Something about the quiet and the fresh air helps me think. I'd been out there for a couple of days already, camping wherever I could find a good spot, nothing planned, just going where the path took me. On the third day, I decided to push a little further off the marked trails, see if I could find a spot where nobody had been for a while. It was late afternoon when I came across the tent. It was off the trail, hidden in a small clearing surrounded by trees. The first thing that struck me was how out of place it looked. There were no signs of anyone around, no fire pit, no gear, just this old, dirty tent with the flap partially open. I don't know why, but I felt this pull to check it out, like I needed to see what was inside. Maybe it was just curiosity or maybe something else. I don't know. I walked up slowly, trying to be as quiet as I could, listening for any sign of movement. But it was dead silent. The closer I got, the more I felt something was wrong. There was a smell coming from the tent, something rotten, like food left out too long, but worse. My stomach turned a little, but I kept going. When I reached the entrance, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to turn around, but another part, the part that got me into this mess, pushed me to look inside. I pulled the flap back, and that's when I saw it. Inside the tent was a mess of things that didn't make sense together. There were clothes, all crumpled and dirty, some of them with dark stains that looked like dried blood. There were ropes, some cut, some tied into loops, and an old, rusted knife stuck into the ground, its blade covered in something that had turned brown and crusty. But what really made me freeze was the pile of photographs scattered on the ground. They were all people, some alone, some in groups, all taken in this same forest, all looking like they didn't know they were being watched. My heart was pounding, and I felt cold all over. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at those photos, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My mind was racing, piecing together the bits of information that didn't fit anywhere else. The tent, the smell, the knife, it all started to add up to something terrible. I knew I had stumbled onto something bad, something dangerous, and I needed to get out of there fast. Just as I turned to leave, I heard the sound of footsteps crunching on the dry leaves, getting closer. My blood ran cold. Whoever owned this tent was coming back, and I was standing there like a deer in headlights. I ducked down, slipping out of sight behind some bushes, my heart beating so hard I could barely breathe. The footsteps got louder, then stopped right outside the tent. I could hear someone breathing heavily, and then the sound of a zipper being pulled, followed by a low, frustrated growl. I didn't dare move. I could see through a gap in the bushes as the man bent down, rummaging through the tent. He was big, with a scruffy beard and a wild look in his eyes. He pulled out the knife, turning it over in his hand, muttering to himself. Then he froze, like he suddenly realized something was off. His head snapped up, and he started looking around, scanning the trees like he was trying to find something or someone. My heart was in my throat as I slowly backed away, trying not to make a sound. But I must have stepped on a branch or something because there was this sharp crack under my boot. The man's head whipped around, and his eyes locked onto the bushes where I was hiding. For a split second, we just stared at each other, and I could see the realization in his eyes. He knew I had seen everything. He started moving toward me, the knife still in his hand, and I knew I had to run. I bolted out of the bushes, sprinting as fast as I could through the trees, not caring about the noise anymore. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the underbrush, shouting for me to stop. But there was no way in hell I was stopping. The forest was a blur around me, branches whipping my face, roots trying to trip me up, but I just kept running. I didn't know where I was going, just away from him, away from that tent. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but the thought of what that man would do if he caught me kept me going. I could hear him getting closer, the sound of his footsteps and his ragged breathing right behind me. My mind was racing, trying to think of a way out, but there was nothing. The trees were thick, and I was lost, completely disoriented. I stumbled, almost fell, but somehow managed to keep my balance. I could see a break in the trees up ahead, maybe a path or a road. I just had to make it there. I burst out of the trees and onto an old, overgrown trail. I didn't stop to look back, just kept running, hoping this path would lead somewhere, anywhere but here. The footsteps behind me were getting fainter, but I didn't dare slow down. My lungs were screaming for air, but I pushed on, driven by pure fear. Finally, I reached a clearing with an old, rundown cabin. I didn't know if it was safe, but I didn't have a choice. I ran up to the door, praying it wasn't locked, and shoved it open. Inside, it was dark and dusty, like nobody had been there in years. I slammed the door shut and threw the bolt, then collapsed against it, gasping for breath. I sat there, shaking, listening for any sound of the man outside. But all I could hear was my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I don't know. Eventually, I realized it was quiet, too quiet. I didn't hear him anymore, and I started to hope that maybe he'd given up. Maybe he'd lost me in the woods. I stayed in that cabin until the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the walls. I was too scared to sleep, too scared to move. But when the sun finally came up, I knew I couldn't stay there forever. I had to get out of the forest, find help, and report what I'd seen. I opened the door slowly, peering out into the clearing. There was no sign of the man, no sign that he'd been there at all. But I didn't let my guard down. I kept moving, sticking to the trails this time, heading back toward where I thought the main path was. It took me hours, but I eventually found my way back to civilization. I went straight to the nearest ranger station and told them everything. They sent out a search party, but they never found the tent or the man. It was like he'd vanished, leaving no trace behind. They told me I was lucky to be alive, and I believed them. I haven't been back to the Smoky Mountains since. I don't think I ever will. I arrived at Yosemite National Park in the late afternoon, excited to spend a few days camping on my own. It was something I had planned for months, just me, nature, and some peace. I found a great spot, not too far from the trail but far enough to feel like I had the place to myself. The area was open, with plenty of space between sites. I set up my tent, got my fire ready, and was looking forward to a quiet evening. Not long after I had everything set up, a man arrived and started setting up his camp. It caught me off guard because there was so much open space, yet he chose to set up pretty close to me. Close enough that I could hear him muttering to himself as he unpacked. I felt uneasy right away. It wasn't the norm for someone to camp that close when there were plenty of other spots available. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself he was probably just a loner like me. I decided to be polite and walked over to say hi. He was in his late 40s, scruffy, with clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He barely looked at me, just grunted in response when I introduced myself. His hands were shaking as he fiddled with his gear. There was something off about him, but I couldn't put my finger on it. As the sun started to set, I kept an eye on him. He didn't seem interested in starting a fire or cooking anything. Instead, he just sat there, staring at his tent, not really doing anything. I tried to focus on my own evening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every time I glanced his way, I found him staring at me. It wasn't a casual glance, it was a hard, focused stare, like he was sizing me up. I decided to ignore him, hoping he'd lose interest. I went back to my tent, zipped it up, and tried to settle in for the night. I could still feel his eyes on me, even with the tent between us. It felt like he was right outside. My gut told me not to sleep, to stay alert. I wished I had something more than a small pocket knife with me, but I hadn't anticipated needing anything else. Hours passed, and I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside, small rustlings that I tried to dismiss as animals, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there, moving around my tent. My heart pounded with every sound. I was trapped in my own mind, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe loudly. Then I heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, just outside my tent. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. The footsteps stopped right at the entrance to my tent. I saw the shadow of his feet through the fabric, just standing there. He didn't say anything, didn't move. He just stood there. My heart was beating so fast I thought it might burst. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something. I grabbed the pocket knife and held it tight, praying he'd go away. But he didn't. I could hear him breathing now, shallow and heavy. Then, without warning, the zipper on my tent started to move. Slowly, like he was trying not to wake me. But I was already wide awake, every nerve in my body on fire. I didn't wait for him to open the tent all the way. I lunged forward, slashing blindly with the knife, screaming at the top of my lungs. I don't know if I hit him or just scared him, but he stumbled back, cursing. I heard him fall, then scramble to his feet. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my flashlight and my car keys, bolted out of the tent, and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't know if he was chasing me or not, but I ran like my life depended on it. The darkness made everything harder, but I didn't care. I just kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps, until I finally saw the lights of the parking lot. I made it to my car, jumped in, and locked the doors, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the keys in the ignition. I didn't wait to catch my breath. I started the car and sped out of there, not caring about the gear I'd left behind. As I drove, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him chasing me, but the road behind me was empty. It wasn't until I was miles away, back in civilization, that I finally let myself cry. The adrenaline was wearing off, and all that was left was the terror. I found a motel and checked in, not even bothering to explain why I looked like I'd been through hell. I just needed to be somewhere with walls and a locked door. I never reported it. What would I say? That a man at Yosemite scared me so badly I ran away? I didn't even know his name. But I knew, deep down, that he wasn't just going to scare me. He was going to do something far worse if I hadn't reacted. I had been camping alone in a forest clearing in Vermont for 3 days. The spot was beautiful, quiet, and far from any other people, just how I liked it. The first night went by without any issues. I set up my tent, made a fire, and cooked some dinner. The stars were out, and everything felt peaceful. But on the second night, I noticed something strange. It was around midnight when I first saw it, a small light flickering in the distance through the trees. At first, I thought it was just another camper. Maybe someone who had set up nearby. But it didn't make sense because I hadn't seen anyone else all day, and the nearest campsite was miles away. The light moved slowly, bobbing up and down like someone was walking with a flashlight. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just assumed it was someone passing through, maybe taking a night hike or something. It stayed in the distance, never coming closer, so I went to sleep. The next night, I saw the light again. This time, it was closer. Maybe 100 yards away, just on the edge of the clearing. It moved the same way, slowly, almost methodically. I stood at the entrance of my tent and watched it for a while, trying to figure out what it was. I even called out, but no one answered. The light just hovered there for a while, then slowly faded back into the trees. I started to feel uneasy. I hadn't seen any other hikers or campers during the day, and this light was starting to feel out of place. But I tried to brush it off. Maybe someone else had found a spot nearby, and I just hadn't noticed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. On the fourth night, the light appeared again. This time, it was even closer, right at the edge of my campsite. I could see it clearly now, a bright white beam moving slowly from side to side. It was searching for something, or someone. I didn't like it. I didn't like that it kept getting closer every night. I felt like I was being watched, like whoever was holding that flashlight knew I was there. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the fire going, hoping the light would stay away, but it didn't. It hovered there for hours, just outside the circle of light from my fire. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and every little sound made me jump. When morning finally came, I was exhausted but relieved. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I was determined to finish my trip. I told myself it was nothing, just another camper or maybe even a park ranger. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, I was ready. I kept my flashlight and my knife close by. I didn't even bother getting into my tent. I just sat by the fire, waiting for the light to appear. And it did. This time, it was right at the edge of my campsite, barely 50 feet away. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to stay calm. I called out again, louder this time. "Who's there?" I shouted into the darkness. The light stopped moving. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, slowly, the light started moving towards me. I stood up, gripping my knife tightly. My flashlight was in my other hand, and I pointed it towards the light, trying to see who was out there. But the beam of my flashlight wasn't strong enough to reach that far. All I could see was the other light getting closer and closer. I started backing up, my mind racing. I didn't want to turn my back on whatever was out there, but I also didn't want to stay and find out what it was. The light kept coming, and I could hear footsteps now, soft but deliberate, crunching on the leaves and twigs. Then, out of the darkness, a voice spoke. It was low and raspy, almost a whisper. "You shouldn't be here," it said. My blood ran cold. There was no mistaking it. Whoever was out there wasn't a camper or a ranger. They were here for me. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. I could hear the footsteps behind me, getting faster, almost running now. The flashlight beam danced around me as I sprinted through the trees, trying to lose them. I tripped over a root and went sprawling to the ground. My flashlight flew out of my hand and went out. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, and looked back. The light was still coming, now just a few yards away. I didn't have time to think. I grabbed my flashlight and ran again, not caring where I ended up. Finally, I burst out of the trees and onto a dirt road. I looked around wildly, trying to get my bearings. The light was still behind me, but it had stopped moving. It just hovered there at the edge of the forest, like whoever was holding it didn't want to leave the cover of the trees. I didn't stop to think. I ran down the road until I reached my car, which was parked a few miles away. I fumbled with the keys, got in, and sped off, not looking back until I was miles away. I don't know who that person was or what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure: I was being hunted. They were watching me, getting closer and closer each night, and if I hadn't left when I did, I'm not sure I'd be here to tell this story. I was hiking in the Appalachians, deep in the woods of West Virginia, when I stumbled across a campsite. At first, it seemed like any other tent setup, a small fire pit, even some camping chairs. But as I got closer, I noticed something was off. There was no one around, and everything looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Food was left out, half-eaten, and a pot of water was still sitting on a cold fire pit. I walked around, calling out, but no one answered. The campsite had this eerie stillness, like it was frozen in time. I figured maybe the campers had gone for a hike, but the longer I looked, the less that made sense. Backpacks were lying on the ground, one of them unzipped, with clothes spilling out. No one would leave their stuff like that. It felt wrong, but I couldn't just walk away. Something about it drew me in, like I needed to understand what had happened. I started looking through their things, hoping to find a clue. There were 2 tents, both zipped up. I hesitated, but then I opened the first one. Inside, there were sleeping bags laid out, a flashlight, some books, but no sign of anyone. The second tent was the same, just stuff, no people. It looked like whoever had been here left in the middle of whatever they were doing. But where had they gone? As I stood there, I realized how quiet it was. No birds, no rustling in the bushes, nothing. Just dead silence. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My skin prickled, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. Every crack of a branch made me jump. I decided to leave. But before I did, I took a quick look around the area, just to see if there were any trails or signs of where the campers might have gone. As I moved further from the campsite, the trees seemed to close in, the light filtering through the leaves growing dimmer. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shoe, just lying there on the ground, half covered in leaves. It was a woman's hiking boot, scuffed up like it had been dragged. Nearby, there was a torn piece of fabric, maybe from a jacket. I didn't want to go any further, but something told me I needed to see where this led. I followed the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. The path twisted through the trees, and every step I took felt heavier, like the air itself was thickening around me. I started hearing things, 2 soft footsteps that weren't mine, faint rustling, like someone was moving through the woods, just out of sight. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or animals, but deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. The trail led me to a small clearing, and that's when I saw it, another piece of clothing, this time a hat, and more signs of a struggle. The ground was disturbed, dirt kicked up, and there were broken branches scattered around. Whoever had been here, they hadn't left willingly. I knew I should have turned back, but I couldn't. I kept going, even though every instinct was telling me to run. The further I went, the more the forest felt like a trap, like it was closing in around me. I started to hear breathing, heavy, labored breathing, but it wasn't mine. I froze, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it seemed to echo from all directions. Then I saw it, a figure, just at the edge of my vision, slipping between the trees. It was tall, hunched over, and moved with an unnatural speed. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it wasn't an animal. My heart was racing, and I turned to leave, but when I looked back, the figure was closer. It wasn't trying to hide anymore. Panic set in. I started running back toward the campsite, my feet stumbling over roots and rocks. I could hear it behind me, that breathing, closer and closer. I didn't dare look back. The campsite was in sight, but it felt like it was miles away. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound of something chasing me through the woods, the crack of branches underfoot. When I burst back into the clearing, I grabbed my backpack and ran. I didn't stop to check if it was following me. I just ran, faster than I ever have in my life. The trees blurred past, and all I could think about was getting out of those woods. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, but eventually, I saw the road through the trees. I didn't stop running until I was at my car, fumbling with the keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. When I finally got in, I locked the doors and just sat there, gasping for breath, my eyes glued to the tree line. But nothing came out of the woods. The forest was still, as if nothing had happened. I don't know what I saw that day or what happened to those campers. I reported it to the rangers, but they didn't find anything, no trace of the campsite, no belongings, nothing. They said it must have been my imagination, that the woods play tricks on you when you're alone. But I know what I saw, and I know I wasn't alone in those woods. I haven't gone hiking since. Every time I close my eyes, I see that figure in the trees, hear that breathing in my ear. I decided to take a break from everything and camp by the river in the Ozark Mountains. I found a spot that was pretty secluded, away from the usual campsites. I just wanted to get away from it all for a couple of days, clear my head. The first day was perfect, just me and the sounds of the river and the forest. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and just sat there, enjoying the quiet. In the evening, as the sun started to dip below the mountains, I noticed a group of 3 men walking along the riverbank. They were rough-looking, with dirty clothes and a kind of wildness about them. They saw me sitting by the fire and came over. I didn't want to be rude, so I waved them over. They introduced themselves, though I can't remember their names now. I wasn't too worried at first. They were just drifters, probably passing through. We talked for a bit, and they seemed all right, maybe a bit off, but nothing that set off alarm bells right away. One of them asked if they could share my fire for a while. I didn't see the harm in it, so I said sure. I offered them some of my food, and they accepted, but the way they ate, like they hadn't had a decent meal in days, made me uneasy. Still, I told myself not to judge. Times are tough for a lot of people. As the night went on, the mood shifted. They started drinking from a flask one of them had, and their talk got louder, more aggressive. They kept asking about where I was from, how long I was planning to stay, and if anyone knew I was out here. I started getting a bad feeling in my gut. They were getting too interested in me, in whether I was alone. One of them, the biggest of the 3, kept staring at me in a way that made my skin crawl. He asked if I had anything valuable in my tent, and when I said no, he just smiled this crooked smile and didn't say anything. The other 2 started laughing, but there was nothing funny about it. It was like they knew something I didn't. I tried to keep calm, but I knew I had to get out of there. I told them I was going to turn in for the night, hoping they'd take the hint and leave. But they didn't. They just stayed by the fire, talking in low voices that I couldn't quite make out. I went into my tent, but I didn't sleep. I just sat there, listening to them outside, my heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like hours, I heard footsteps coming closer to the tent. One of them whispered something, and I heard the sound of a knife being pulled from a sheath. I froze, not knowing what to do. My gear was in the tent with me, but nothing that could really defend myself against 3 guys with knives. I decided I couldn't just sit there and wait for them to make the first move. I grabbed the closest thing I had to a weapon, a heavy flashlight, and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. When I stepped out, they were right there, standing around the fire, staring at me like they were waiting for something. The big one was holding a knife, his eyes locked on me. Before I could think, I swung the flashlight at him with everything I had. It caught him off guard, and I managed to knock the knife out of his hand. He stumbled back, cursing, but the other 2 lunged at me. I barely had time to react. I hit one of them in the face, but the other grabbed my arm and twisted it behind my back, forcing me to drop the flashlight. I was on the ground, struggling to break free, when I heard the big guy yell something. I didn't catch what he said, but whatever it was made the guy holding me down loosen his grip for just a second. That was all I needed. I kicked back as hard as I could, catching him in the knee. He let go, and I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing for a way out. They were coming at me again, and I knew I couldn't take all 3 of them. I bolted for the river, hoping I could lose them in the dark. I could hear them shouting behind me, crashing through the underbrush. I ran until my lungs burned, the cold air stabbing at my throat. When I reached the river, I didn't stop. I plunged into the water, letting the current carry me downstream. The water was freezing, but I didn't care. I kept going, staying low, trying to stay quiet. I could hear them on the bank, cursing and calling out to each other, but they didn't follow me into the river. I let the current take me as far as I could before I climbed out, shivering and exhausted. I didn't know where I was, but I kept moving, putting as much distance between me and them as possible. Eventually, I found a dirt road, and after what felt like hours of walking, I flagged down a car. The driver looked at me like I was crazy when I told him what had happened, but he let me in and drove me to the nearest town. I didn't report it to the police. I just wanted to get as far away from those mountains as I could. I don't know what those guys were planning, but I'm sure it wasn't anything good. I had been camping alone in a remote part of Maine. I needed the solitude, a break from everything. The campsite was deep in the woods, far from the main trails. It was the kind of place where you didn't expect to see anyone, especially this late in the season. The air was crisp, and the trees were starting to turn, painting the forest in shades of red and gold. I set up my tent by a small clearing, close to a stream, and spent the first day hiking around, enjoying the quiet. On the second day, I was sitting by the fire I'd made, cooking up some dinner when I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, crunching on the leaves. I looked up and saw a man in a ranger uniform walking toward my campsite. I hadn't seen anyone else since I got there, so it caught me off guard. He was tall, with a scruffy beard, and his uniform looked a bit worn, like it had seen better days. He greeted me with a nod and said he was just doing a routine check of the area. His voice was deep, and there was something off about it, a flatness that didn't match the smile on his face. He asked me how long I'd been out there, and if I'd seen anyone else around. I told him I'd been there since yesterday and hadn't seen a soul. He nodded again, then said he needed to check my campsite, make sure everything was in order. That seemed strange to me, but I didn't want to argue. I hadn't done anything wrong, and I figured it was just some kind of protocol. I stepped aside and let him look around. He started walking through my campsite, poking at my gear with the tip of his boot, lifting the corners of my tarp, checking my tent. The whole time, he kept talking, asking me questions about where I was from, why I was out here alone. His questions were casual, but there was something off about the way he asked them, like he was more interested in the answers than he should have been. As he was rifling through my stuff, I noticed he didn't have a name tag on his uniform. That struck me as odd. Every ranger I'd ever met had one. When I asked him about it, he paused, just for a second, before saying it must have fallen off somewhere along the trail. He didn't sound convincing, and that's when I started to feel uneasy. I watched him more closely after that. The way he moved, the way his eyes darted around, it didn't sit right with me. He wasn't just checking my campsite, he was looking for something, or maybe trying to hide something. His behavior became more erratic, like he was getting frustrated. He started asking the same questions again, his voice a little more insistent each time. I could feel my heart start to race, a tightness in my chest. When he was done, he stood there, staring at me. The smile had faded from his face, replaced by a hard look that made my skin crawl. He told me I needed to pack up and leave, that this area was off limits for camping. I knew that wasn't true. I'd done my research, gotten the permits. There was no way this spot was restricted. I told him that, trying to keep my voice steady, but he just stepped closer, towering over me. He repeated that I needed to leave, his tone more forceful this time, almost threatening. I could see his hand twitch near his belt, where a flashlight hung, but there was no gun, no radio. Nothing that a real ranger would have. That's when it hit me, this guy wasn't a ranger at all. My mind started racing, trying to figure out what to do. I was miles away from the nearest ranger station, no cell service, and it was getting dark. If this guy wasn't who he said he was, then what did he want? My instincts were screaming at me to get out of there, but I didn't want to make any sudden moves. I had to play it cool, act like I wasn't onto him. I told him I'd pack up right away, trying to sound cooperative. He didn't say anything, just stood there, watching me with those cold eyes. I started gathering my things, moving slowly, keeping an eye on him. Every time I looked up, he was closer, like he was waiting for the right moment to make his move. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was toying with me, enjoying the control he had over the situation. I kept glancing at the tree line, thinking about making a run for it, but I didn't know if I'd get far. The thought of being chased through the woods by this guy was terrifying, but staying there with him felt just as dangerous. As I finished packing, I noticed he had drifted over to the edge of the clearing, his back to me. It was the first time he wasn't staring at me, and I knew this might be my only chance. I tightened the straps on my pack, making sure everything was secure, and slowly started moving toward the path that led back to my car. I tried to keep my steps quiet, but every crunch of leaves under my boots sounded like thunder in my ears. I was halfway to the path when he turned around. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a split second, we just stared at each other. Then he started walking toward me, not running, but with a purpose that made my blood run cold. I bolted. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I forced them to move, to push through the underbrush. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear him behind me, his footsteps pounding on the ground, getting closer. The trees blurred past as I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had no idea where I was going, just that I had to get away. The trail twisted and turned, and I nearly lost my footing a few times, but I kept going. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I could still hear him, closer now, and I knew he was gaining on me. The thought of what would happen if he caught me made my legs move faster, the adrenaline pushing me forward. I burst out onto the dirt road where my car was parked, my lungs burning, legs aching. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door just as he broke through the trees, his face twisted in anger. He lunged at the car as I jammed the key into the ignition, his hands slapping against the window. I turned the key, praying the engine would start. It roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal, tires spinning in the dirt as I tore down the road. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, watching me drive away, his figure growing smaller and smaller until it was swallowed by the trees. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. My hands were still shaking as I pulled into a gas station, the reality of what just happened hitting me all at once. I sat there for a long time, trying to calm down, to make sense of it. Who was that guy? What did he want? The questions swirled in my mind, but I didn't have any answers. I reported the incident to the local authorities, but they didn't seem to take it too seriously. They said they'd send someone out to check the area, but I could tell they thought I was overreacting. Maybe they were right, maybe it wasn't as bad as it seemed in the moment. But deep down, I knew I'd narrowly escaped something terrible. I decided to take a solo camping trip to a national park in Utah. I had been there once before, but only for a day hike. This time, I wanted to really immerse myself in the wilderness, away from everything. The idea of being alone in nature was something I looked forward to. I found a spot that was far from the main trails, surrounded by tall trees and rocky cliffs. It felt like I was the only person in the world. On my second day, while I was setting up camp for the night, a van pulled up nearby. It surprised me because I thought I had chosen a remote enough spot, but they were the only other people I had seen all day. A couple got out, smiling and waving. They looked like your typical outdoorsy types, suntanned, in their 30s maybe, with hiking boots and all the gear. They introduced themselves, saying they were just passing through and saw my campfire. At first, they seemed friendly enough. We talked for a while, mostly about hiking and camping. They told me they'd been traveling across the country, visiting national parks, living out of their van. It sounded like a nice life. They offered me a beer, which I accepted, and we sat around the fire, talking about the best trails in the park. As the night wore on, though, something started to feel off. The woman, Sarah, kept asking questions that felt too personal. At first, it was just about my trip, why I was camping alone, how long I planned to stay, but then it got more uncomfortable. She wanted to know where I was from, if anyone knew where I was, if I had a partner waiting for me back home. The man, Jake, was quieter but had this way of watching me that made my skin crawl. He would smile, but his eyes never seemed to match it. I tried to keep the conversation light, but they kept steering it back to me, my plans, my life. It felt like they were trying to size me up. I started to get a bad feeling, so I made an excuse about being tired and needing to turn in for the night. I thought that would be the end of it, but they didn't seem ready to leave. Instead, they suggested we all camp together, saying it was safer that way. Jake even offered to help move my tent closer to their van. I refused, saying I liked my spot and was used to being on my own. They exchanged a look that made my stomach drop. It was like they were silently agreeing on something that didn't involve me. Sarah then said they had some extra supplies in the van if I needed anything: food, water, whatever. She insisted I at least come take a look. I hesitated, but they were both staring at me, waiting. I felt cornered, like I had no choice but to agree. So, I followed them to the van, my heart pounding. When we got to the van, Jake opened the back doors, and I saw the inside was crammed with stuffed blankets, camping gear, boxes of food. But something about it felt wrong. There was a smell, something chemical, and I noticed some of the items looked out of place, like the kind of things you wouldn't need for camping. I saw a roll of duct tape, a box of zip ties, and a large, empty cooler. Before I could react, Sarah grabbed my arm, not hard, but enough to make me tense up. She smiled and said I should really consider staying with them for the night, for safety. The way she said it wasn't comforting, it felt like a threat. Jake was just standing there, blocking my way back to my camp. I forced a smile and said I appreciated the offer but really preferred to be on my own. I tried to pull my arm away, but Sarah held on a second longer than she needed to, her nails digging into my skin just a bit. When she finally let go, I backed away, saying I needed to get back to my camp. As I turned to leave, Jake spoke up for the first time in a while. He said, "You know, it's easy to get lost out here. No one would find you for days." His tone was casual, but the words hit me like a punch. I didn't respond. I just kept walking, not too fast, trying to seem calm. When I got back to my camp, I didn't bother with the fire. I went straight to my tent, but I didn't get inside. Instead, I grabbed my backpack and started packing up my things as quietly as I could. My hands were shaking, and I was trying to stay focused, but all I could think about was getting out of there before they decided to come back. As I was packing, I heard footsteps. I froze, listening. They were slow, deliberate, getting closer. I peeked out of the tent and saw them standing by the edge of my campsite, just watching. They didn't say anything, didn't move closer, but they were too close for comfort. I had to leave. I stuffed everything into my pack, not caring if it was organized, and grabbed my flashlight. I didn't bother with my tent. I could come back for it later, or not at all. I just needed to get out of there. I started walking down the trail, trying to stay calm, but my mind was racing. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see them following me. The darkness of the forest seemed to close in around me, every rustle of leaves sounding like footsteps. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the main trailhead where I had parked my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling, and finally got inside. As I started the engine, I looked back down the trail, half expecting to see them standing there, but there was no one. I drove out of that park as fast as I could, not caring about the speed limit or the curves in the road. My mind was racing with what had just happened, the way they had turned from friendly to threatening so quickly. I kept driving until I reached a town, somewhere with lights and people. The next morning, I reported the encounter to the park rangers, but there wasn't much they could do. They said they'd keep an eye out, but they didn't seem too concerned. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had gotten too close to something terrible, something that could have ended very differently. I've been camping since then, but I'm more cautious now, more aware of who's around me. I still think about that couple sometimes, wondering what they were really planning that night, and how close I came to finding out. I was driving home from a long day at work, heading back to my place in Tucson. The drive along that rural highway through Arizona was always a bit eerie, especially at night. The desert stretches out for miles, and the isolation can mess with your mind if you're not careful. Around midnight, I saw a hitchhiker on the side of the road. He looked like he'd been out there for a while, and I felt a pang of sympathy. I usually wouldn't stop, but something about the way he was standing there made me think he might be in trouble. I pulled over, and he got in without a word, just a nod of thanks. At first, he seemed normal enough. He had a weathered face and a bit of stubble, wearing a jacket that looked like it had seen better days. I offered him a bottle of water from the passenger seat, which he accepted with a grateful smile. We started talking to pass the time. He said his name was Jake and that he was trying to get to a town up ahead. I told him I was heading in that direction, so I could drop him off if he needed. He was friendly enough, chatting about the usual small talk, how long he'd been on the road, his plans for the future, that sort of thing. But as we drove deeper into the desert, his questions became more specific. He asked me about my job, where I lived, and how my family was. The questions seemed normal at first, but then he started asking about things only someone who knew a lot about me would ask. I mentioned that I had a dog, and he knew its name right away. I was surprised but didn't think much of it. Maybe he had seen a photo or something. Then he mentioned my car, saying he'd noticed the specific model and the small dent on the rear bumper, details I hadn't shared with him. The conversation started to feel unsettling. He knew details about my daily routine, things that made me realize he might have been watching me. He talked about my work schedule, my favorite coffee shop, and even mentioned that he had seen me there a few times. I tried to stay calm and steer the conversation back to safer topics. But every time I thought I deflected the creepiness, he'd bring up something else that made my skin crawl. He knew about the little things, like how I usually took the scenic route home because I liked the view of the mountains. The more he talked, the more I felt a knot forming in my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been following me for a while. I kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, trying to gauge his intentions. His calm demeanor didn't match the unsettling things he was saying. I decided to take a detour to see if I could lose him. I turned off the main highway onto a smaller, less traveled road, hoping he'd think I was going a different way. I tried to act normal, like I was just taking a different route home. But Jake didn't seem bothered by the change in direction. He continued talking, almost as if he didn't notice we were off the main road. He even mentioned that he liked this route better because it was less busy, which only made me more anxious. I was getting desperate. I made a quick stop at a small roadside diner, hoping to get some help or at least buy some time. I pretended to pull over for a rest, but as soon as I got out, I called the police and explained the situation. They said they'd send someone to check it out. While I waited, I kept an eye on Jake. He stayed in the car, looking around like he was just enjoying the night. I felt a mix of fear and frustration, knowing that he was still so close. When the police arrived, I explained everything to them and pointed out Jake. The officers approached Jake and asked him to step out of the car. He was cooperative, but there was something cold in his eyes that made me shiver. They searched him in the car, but it didn't look like they found anything incriminating. After talking to Jake, the police came back to me. They said he was just a drifter and didn't have any outstanding warrants. They couldn't detain him without evidence of a crime. They advised me to be cautious and offered to escort me home if I wanted. I thanked them but decided to drive the rest of the way on my own. I felt safer with the police nearby, but I didn't want to linger. As I drove away from the diner, I glanced back and saw Jake still standing by the police car, watching me. I made it home without further incident, but I haven't stopped thinking about that night. I changed my routine, and I'm more careful about my personal information now. I've never picked up another hitchhiker since. I decided to take a solo camping trip in the Colorado Rockies. I'd been up there before with friends, but never alone. I wanted some peace and quiet, away from the city, and the idea of being surrounded by nature felt like the perfect escape. I picked a spot deep in the forest, away from the usual trails, where I knew I'd have some privacy. The first day went smoothly. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and just enjoyed the calm of the forest. The sun was shining, and there wasn't a sound except for the occasional bird or rustle in the bushes. By the time the sun started to set, I had a small fire going, and I sat there, feeling more relaxed than I had in a long time. But as the night came on, I started to feel a little uneasy. It wasn't anything specific at first, just a sense that something was off. The forest around me was too quiet, like everything had gone still. I told myself it was just nerves from being out there alone, so I forced myself to relax. As I lay in my tent that night, I thought I heard footsteps outside. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or something moving through the trees. But the steps sounded too heavy, too deliberate. I stayed quiet, listening, my heart beating faster. After a few minutes, the footsteps stopped, and I eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I found something strange. Around my campsite, the ground was disturbed, like someone had been walking around during the night. It wasn't just one set of footprints either, but several, circling the area where I'd been sleeping. My first thought was that it must have been animals, but the tracks were clearly human. I started to feel uneasy, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just hikers passing through, though I hadn't seen anyone around since I arrived. I decided to shake it off and enjoy the rest of my day. I hiked up a nearby trail, keeping an eye out for anyone, but the forest was empty. By the time I got back to my campsite, it was late afternoon. The feeling of being watched had grown stronger throughout the day. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, but there was never anyone there. I started to regret coming out here alone. That night, the footsteps returned. I was lying in my tent, trying to sleep, but I couldn't ignore the sound of someone moving around outside. It wasn't just walking this time. I heard twigs snapping, and the distinct sound of something being dragged across the ground. My heart was pounding, but I didn't move. I just lay there, too scared to even breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I waited for what felt like hours before I finally worked up the courage to unzip my tent and look outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow over the campsite. There was no one there, but I could see the tracks in the dirt, fresh and clear. Someone had been out there, watching me. I didn't sleep much that night. When the sun finally rose, I packed up my things, ready to head back to my car. But as I was packing, I found something that made my blood run cold. Tied to a tree near my campsite was a small bundle of sticks and leaves, arranged in a way that looked deliberate, almost like a warning. I left in a hurry, but as I made my way back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every so often, I hear a branch snap or leaves rustle behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. I walked faster, almost running at some points, desperate to get out of that forest. I reached my car by late afternoon, exhausted and on edge. But when I got there, I found another unsettling sign. My car had been tampered with. The tires were slashed, and the windows had been smeared with something that looked like mud or blood. Whoever had been following me wanted to make sure I couldn't leave easily. I was stuck, miles from the nearest town, with no cell service. I had no choice but to start walking, hoping to find help before nightfall. The whole time, I kept hearing those footsteps, always just out of sight, following me through the trees. As the sun began to set, I finally saw headlights in the distance. A car was coming up the road, and I waved it down frantically. The driver, an older man, stopped and let me in. I told him what had happened, but he didn't seem surprised. He said there were stories about people going missing in these woods, and that I was lucky to have made it out. We drove to the nearest town, and I called the police. They went out to the campsite, but they didn't find anyone. They did find the bundle of sticks I mentioned, though, and they said it wasn't the first time they'd seen something like that. There were reports of people disappearing around that area, but nothing was ever confirmed. I've thought about the trip a lot since then, and I'm still not sure who was out there or what they wanted. But I know one thing for sure, I'm never going camping alone again. I was out camping in the woods during a heavy storm. The rain was coming down hard, and the wind was making the trees sway. I had my tent set up and a small fire going, trying to keep warm and dry. The sound of the rain was so loud, it was hard to hear anything else. I was just settling in for the night when I heard a noise outside. I unzipped my tent and peeked out. I saw a man standing near the edge of my campsite. He was drenched, holding a rifle, and looking around nervously. He noticed me and walked over quickly. My heart started racing. "Hey," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "I need help. My tent got washed away, and I'm lost. Can I stay here for a bit?" I was hesitant. Something about him seemed off. But the rain was pouring, and he looked desperate. I nodded, and he came closer to the fire, trying to warm up. "Thanks," he said. "Name's Mike." "What's yours?" "Eric," I replied, keeping my eyes on him. We sat there in silence for a while. The rain kept coming down, and the fire was our only source of light. I noticed Mike kept looking around, as if he was expecting someone to show up. It made me uneasy. "You out here alone?" he asked suddenly. "Yeah," I said. "Just needed some time away from everything." He nodded but didn't say anything else. I could see the rifle was old but well maintained. I wondered why he was carrying it out in this storm. After a while, Mike stood up and walked around the campsite, looking into the darkness. "You hear that?" he asked. I shook my head, straining to hear over the rain. "No, what is it?" He came back to the fire, his face tense. "I think there's someone else out there. I've been hearing noises all night." I didn't hear anything, but his paranoia was starting to get to me. I tried to brush it off. "It's probably just the wind and the rain," I said. He didn't seem convinced. He kept pacing around, looking out into the trees. I tried to ignore him and focus on keeping the fire going, but it was hard. Then, I saw it. A faint light flickering in the distance. It wasn't lightning, it was too steady. It looked like a flashlight. "Do you see that?" I asked, pointing. Mike turned and saw the light. His face went pale. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice shaking. "Now." "Why?" I asked, my heart pounding. "That's not just anyone out there," he said. "It's a poacher. He's been hunting protected animals in this area. I caught him earlier tonight, and he threatened me. That's why I had to leave my camp." My blood ran cold. I grabbed my things quickly, trying to pack up as fast as I could. Mike was already moving, his rifle ready. "We need to stay together," he said. "And be quiet. If he finds us, we're dead." We started moving through the woods, the rain making it hard to see or hear anything. The light kept moving closer, and I could feel my heart beating in my throat. We stumbled through the trees, trying to stay ahead of the poacher. Mike led the way, his rifle ready. I followed close behind, trying to keep up. The light kept getting closer, and I could hear footsteps now. The poacher was moving fast, and he was getting closer. Mike stopped suddenly and motioned for me to be quiet. We crouched down behind a large tree, trying to stay hidden. The light came closer, and I could see the outline of a man holding a flashlight and a rifle. He was looking around, searching for us. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure he could hear it. We stayed as still as possible, hoping he would pass by. He stopped right in front of our hiding spot, shining his light around. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't see us. After what felt like an eternity, he moved on, continuing through the woods. We waited until the light was far away before moving again. "We need to find a place to hide until morning," Mike whispered. "He won't give up easily." We kept moving, trying to find a safe spot. The rain was relentless, and we were both soaked to the bone. Finally, we found a small cave. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. We crawled inside and tried to make ourselves as small as possible. "We'll stay here until the rain stops," Mike said. "Then we'll head to the ranger station and report him." I nodded, trying to stay calm. We sat in the dark, listening to the rain and the occasional distant footsteps. The night seemed to drag on forever. Every time I heard a noise, my heart would race. I kept thinking about the poacher out there, looking for us. Finally, the rain started to let up. The sky was getting lighter, and I knew morning was coming. "We should move now," Mike said, "before he finds us." We crawled out of the cave and started making our way through the woods again. The rain had turned the ground to mud, making it hard to walk. We moved as quickly and quietly as we could, heading towards the ranger station. I could feel my anxiety growing with every step. Then, we heard it. The sound of footsteps behind us, moving fast. The poacher had found us. "Run!" Mike shouted, pushing me ahead. We ran as fast as we could, the mud slowing us down. I could hear the poacher getting closer, his footsteps pounding behind us. We burst out of the trees and saw the ranger station ahead. Relief flooded through me, but we weren't safe yet. Mike fired his rifle, and I heard a shout behind us. The poacher had been hit, but he kept coming. We reached the ranger station and banged on the door, shouting for help. The door flew open, and a ranger pulled us inside. "What's going on?" he asked. "There's a poacher out there," Mike said, gasping for breath. "He's trying to kill us." The ranger grabbed his radio and called for backup. "Stay here," he said. "We'll handle this." We waited inside, our hearts pounding. We heard more gunshots outside, then silence. After a few minutes, the ranger came back in. "It's over," he said. "We've got him." I collapsed into a chair, relief washing over me. We were safe. The nightmare was finally over. I set up my tent quickly as the rain began to fall. The storm had been brewing all afternoon, and I was alone in the forest, miles from the nearest town. The sound of the rain on the tent was soothing at first, but as night fell, it turned into a relentless drumming. I lay on my sleeping bag, listening to the wind howl and the trees creak. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. I thought I heard something outside. I lay still, listening. There it was again, a rustling sound, close to my tent. My heart started to pound. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make any noise. I clicked it on and shone it at the tent wall, but the rain was so loud I couldn't hear anything else. Then I saw it, a shadow moving outside the tent. I froze, holding my breath. The shadow moved closer, and I could see a hand pressing against the tent fabric. Panic set in. I tried to remember if I had locked my car, which was parked a short distance away. I couldn't recall. I heard a voice, low and urgent. "Hey, I need shelter." "Let me in," the voice said. The voice didn't sound right. There was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. I didn't answer. I hoped whoever it was would think the tent was empty and move on. But the shadow stayed. The hand moved to the zipper of the tent, and I heard the slow, deliberate sound of it being pulled down. "Please, let me in." "It's pouring out here," the voice insisted, more forcefully this time. I grabbed the small camping knife I kept in my bag. My hands were shaking. The zipper stopped halfway down, and the rain started to pour into the tent. I could see the outline of a man now, crouched at the entrance. His silhouette was distorted by the flashlight beam, making him look even more menacing. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "I have a knife." The man paused. There was a moment of silence, broken only by the sound of the rain. Then he spoke again, calmer this time. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just need to get out of the rain," he said. Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. I knew I couldn't let him in. I had to get out of there. I slipped on my boots and grabbed my backpack, all while keeping an eye on the figure outside. He was still crouched there, waiting. I decided to make a run for it. I took a deep breath, then lunged for the tent flap, shoving the man aside as hard as I could. He fell back with a grunt, and I scrambled out into the storm. The rain was blinding, but I didn't stop. I ran towards my car, slipping and stumbling in the mud. I heard him shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. My car was where I had left it, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands slick with rain. I finally got the door open and threw myself inside, locking the doors just as he reached the car. He pounded on the window, his face twisted with anger. "Let me in," he screamed, but I could see now that his eyes were wild, his clothes torn and dirty. He didn't look like someone who just needed shelter. He looked dangerous. I started the car and threw it into reverse, backing away from him as fast as I could. He chased after me, slipping in the mud, but I didn't stop. I sped down the narrow forest road, my heart racing, the rain hammering against the windshield. I drove for miles, not daring to slow down. When I finally reached a small town, I pulled into a gas station and parked under the bright lights. I was shaking all over, my clothes soaked through. I called the police and told them what had happened. They said they would send someone to check the area. I waited at the gas station until dawn, too scared to go back. When the police arrived, they took my statement and went to look for the man, but they didn't find him. They said the storm had probably driven him away, but I wasn't so sure. I never went camping alone again. I had been hiking all day, and the rain started coming down hard as evening approached. I was in the middle of the woods, far from any town or road. The trail was muddy, and I was soaked. I needed to find shelter quickly. That's when I saw the cabin through the trees. It looked old and abandoned, but it was better than being out in the storm. I pushed through the wet underbrush and reached the cabin. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, it was dark and smelled musty. I shook off the rain and stepped in, hoping to find a dry spot to rest. I found an old chair and a table, some broken shelves, and a small fireplace. There were no lights, but I had a flashlight in my pack. I set my things down and explored a bit. The cabin was just one room, with a couple of small windows. The rain pounded on the roof, and the wind howled outside. I felt a bit uneasy, but it was better than being out in the storm. I decided to make a small fire to warm up and dry off. As I was gathering some old wood from a pile in the corner, I noticed something odd. There were fresh food wrappers and an empty water bottle under the table. It looked like someone had been here recently. My heart started to race. What if they came back? I tried to calm myself, thinking it could have been a hiker like me, seeking shelter from the rain. I lit the fire and warmed my hands. The small flickering flames cast shadows on the walls, making the cabin feel even more eerie. I decided to stay close to the door, just in case. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and it was getting darker. I sat in the chair, trying to relax, but every creak and groan of the cabin made me jump. A loud noise from outside made me freeze. I turned off my flashlight and listened. Footsteps. Someone was coming. Panic set in. I looked around for a place to hide. There was a small closet near the back wall. I grabbed my things and slipped inside, closing the door as quietly as I could. I could hear voices now, muffled by the rain. Two men, talking and laughing. The door creaked open, and I held my breath. They stomped inside, shaking off the rain. I peeked through a crack in the closet door and saw them clearly. They were big, rough-looking men, and they carried guns. They started talking about a deal, something about money and a meeting place. My heart pounded in my chest. These weren't just hikers. They were criminals. I was trapped in their hideout, and they had no idea I was there. I needed to get out, but how? One of the men walked over to the fireplace, noticing the warm embers. "Someone's been here," he said, his voice gruff. My stomach dropped. They knew. I tried to stay as still and quiet as possible, but my mind was racing. What would they do if they found me? The other man cursed and started looking around. I could hear them opening drawers and moving things. They were getting closer to the closet. I pressed myself against the back wall, praying they wouldn't find me. The door handle turned, and I held my breath. The door swung open, and I saw the man's face. He froze for a second, then his eyes whitened. "What the hell?" he shouted, reaching for me. I didn't think, just acted. I shoved past him, knocking him off balance, and ran for the door. The other man shouted and lunged at me, but I ducked and sprinted out into the rain. I didn't look back. I just ran. The rain was blinding, and the forest was dark, but I kept going. I could hear them behind me, crashing through the trees, shouting. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they would give out, but I didn't stop. I needed to find help, get away from them. I stumbled down a hill, slipping in the mud, and crashed into a stream. The cold water shocked me, but I kept going, following the stream, hoping it would lead me to safety. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, and I risked a glance back. They weren't there. I kept moving, more carefully now, trying to stay hidden. The stream led to a dirt road, and I followed it, praying for a car or a house, anything. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights. I waved frantically, and the car stopped. It was a ranger. I told him everything, barely able to speak from exhaustion and fear. He took me to the nearest station, where I finally felt safe. They never found the men or the cabin. I still think about that night, how close I came to being caught. I haven't been back to the woods since. I rented a cabin by a lake to work on my novel. The place was quiet, perfect for writing. It was old, but cozy. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, and the trees around it rustled softly in the breeze. I thought it was just what I needed to get away from the noise of the city. On the second day, I noticed something odd about the cabin. There was a section of the floor in the living room that sounded hollow when I walked over it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I moved the rug and saw a trapdoor. It took some effort to pry it open, but I managed. Below was a small, dark room. I used my phone's flashlight to look around. There were old, dusty boxes and a table with a few papers scattered on it. I climbed down and started going through the boxes. Most of them had old clothes and books, but one had photos. They were of a man tied to a chair, bruised and bleeding. My heart started pounding. This wasn't what I expected to find. I went through the papers on the table. They were notes about the man in the photos. They talked about debts and warnings, and how he wouldn't listen. It was clear he had been tortured. I felt sick to my stomach. I wanted to leave, but I heard a noise from above. Someone was in the cabin. I froze, listening. Footsteps moved across the floor, then stopped. I heard voices. They were talking about coming back to check on the place, making sure no one found anything. Panic set in. I had to get out of there, but I couldn't go up now. They would see me. I stayed as quiet as possible, hoping they wouldn't come down. They moved around, checking rooms, talking about the last time they were there. One of them mentioned the guy in the photos. My heart sank. They were the ones who did this. I had to think fast. I saw a small window near the ceiling of the hidden room. It was a tight squeeze, but I could fit. I carefully climbed up and pushed it open, trying not to make any noise. I squeezed through and fell into the bushes outside. I heard one of the men coming closer, so I stayed low and crawled away from the cabin. Once I was far enough, I got up and ran. I didn't know where to go, just away. The woods were thick, and I stumbled a few times, but I kept going. I found a spot to hide and catch my breath. My mind was racing. I needed to get help, but my phone was still in the cabin. I decided to head towards the nearest town. It was a few miles away, but I didn't have a choice. I kept off the main paths, sticking to the trees. I didn't want them to find me. Every noise made me jump. I was scared they were following me. It started getting dark, and I was still in the woods. I found a large tree and hid behind it, trying to stay calm. I waited for a while, listening for any signs of them. It was quiet, but I didn't feel safe. I needed to keep moving. I finally saw lights in the distance. It was the town. Relief washed over me, but I couldn't relax yet. I hurried towards the lights, trying to stay hidden. I reached the edge of the town and saw a gas station. I went inside and asked the clerk to call the police. The police arrived quickly. I told them everything, from the hidden room to the men in the cabin. They took me seriously and sent officers to check it out. They found the cabin and the room, but the men were gone. They said I did the right thing by running. They took me to the station to give my statement. It was late, and I was exhausted, but I was safe. They promised to investigate and keep me updated. I was just glad to be away from that cabin. A few days later, they called. They found the men. They had a history of crime, including the kidnapping and torture of the man in the photos. They were arrested, and I felt a sense of relief knowing they were caught. I went back to the city, deciding I had enough of cabins and lakes for a while. It was a terrifying experience, but I was glad I got out alive. I'm more cautious now, but I still love writing. I just do it from the safety of my apartment.